He depleted our retirement account to fund his affair with his secretary. 3 months later, I watched from my new beachfront property as federal agents raided his office. The anonymous tax fraud tip that triggered the investigation came from an untraceable email account, one I'd created specifically for this purpose. 7 years of marriage had taught me patience. 6 months of betrayal taught me precision. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The hotel conference room buzzed with the familiar tension of high-stakes negotiation. Men and women in tailored suits exchanged polite but guarded smiles, each representing firms with competing interests in the outcome of today's settlement discussion. I adjusted my blazer, charcoal gray, conservatively cut but impeccably tailored, and reviewed my notes one final time. Across the mahogany table, David Chen, IRS Criminal Investigation Division Special Agent, nodded slightly in my direction. Our previous communications had been entirely confidential. Encrypted emails, secure phone lines, carefully planned meetings in locations where we wouldn't be recognized. To everyone else in the room, we were strangers. Only we knew the truth. That every document in his government-issued briefcase had come from me. The door opened, and my husband Michael entered, flanked by his attorney. His confident stride faltered when he saw me. This wasn't part of his script. In his version of events, I was still the devastated wife, too emotionally broken by his infidelity to function, too financially dependent to fight back. The woman, he'd dismissed as just a simple housewife with no head for business, was now seated at the table where his financial fate would be decided. Rachel? His voice carried that familiar tone of condescension poorly disguised as concern. What are you doing here? This is a serious legal matter. You should let the professionals handle this. I smiled, the kind of smile that reveals nothing, yet promises everything. I am a professional, Michael. In fact, I'm the forensic accountant who uncovered your elaborate tax evasion scheme. I slid a business card across the table. Rachel Sullivan, CPA, CFE. I've been consulting with the IRS for the past 3 months. The color drained from his face as 7 years of underestimation collided with the reality before him. His attorney leaned over, whispering urgently. But Michael wasn't listening. He was staring at me, finally seeing what had been there all along. The journey to this moment began 6 months earlier with a simple notification on my phone, a credit card alert for a hotel charge I didn't recognize. That single alert had unraveled the fabric of what I thought was my life, revealing a pattern of deception far more complex than a simple affair. The diamond tennis bracelet I discovered hidden in his golf bag wasn't meant for me. The unexplained business trips didn't involve clients. The late nights at the office weren't devoted to building our future. But those betrayals, painful as they were, proved to be just the surface of Michael's deception. Our shared financial history had always been characterized by what Michael called a clear division of responsibilities. He managed the investments, tax planning, and business affairs. I handled the household budget, everyday expenses, and charitable contributions. "You're so good with the little things," he would say, as though managing our daily lives was somehow less significant than his quarterly portfolio reviews. What he never knew, what he never bothered to discover, was that before we met, I had been on track to become a partner at one of the country's most prestigious accounting firms. My degrees in finance and forensic accounting hadn't disappeared when I took his last name. They had simply been filed away, waiting for the moment when they might be needed. That moment arrived when I discovered not just emotional betrayal, but financial devastation. Our retirement accounts, emptied, our joint savings, drained to a fraction of what they should have been. Our investment portfolio, leveraged in ways that placed all the risk on my future while securing his present indulgences. My initial shock quickly gave way to something colder, more calculated. The skills that had once made me a rising star in accounting hadn't faded. They had sharpened through years of managing increasingly complex household finances and tracking the labyrinthine expenses of our family life. The night after discovering the affair, I sat at our kitchen island, laptop open, a glass of his expensive Bordeaux in my hand. While he texted excuses about another late night at the office, I began the meticulous process of reconstructing our financial history. Bank statements, credit card records, investment accounts, property deeds, digital breadcrumbs that would lead me through the hidden landscape of our marriage. By morning, I had created a preliminary financial timeline that raised more questions than it answered. Large cash withdrawals that corresponded with his business trips, wire transfers to shell companies with vague purposes, investment losses that somehow never appeared on our tax returns, and most concerning, a pattern of reported business expenses that seemed to fluctuate wildly depending on how profitable his company had been each quarter. Michael's consulting firm specialized in helping mid-sized businesses optimize their operations and maximize profitability. The irony wasn't lost on me. The efficiency expert who had built a career telling others how to run their businesses had been running a financial shell game in his own backyard. I needed more information, but I also needed time. If Michael suspected I was investigating him, everything would disappear. Digital records would be deleted, paper trails shredded, accounts closed. My advantage lay in his underestimation, as long as he believed I remained the trusting wife, focused on recovering. From his infidelity rather than uncovering his fraud, I would have the time and access I needed. So I played the role he expected. I cried when appropriate, raged when anticipated, and ultimately presented the wounded but willing spouse interested in reconciliation. Each emotional display was calculated, each apparent vulnerability strategic. While he believed he was managing my reaction to his affair, I was building a case that would ultimately destroy everything he had built. Our home office became my command center during the hours he was away. The background in forensic accounting that he had dismissed as unnecessary complication for a woman who would obviously prioritize family over career became my most potent weapon. I created systems for organizing and analyzing the information I gathered, spreadsheets that tracked financial movements, timelines that correlated business activities with personal expenditures, network maps that connected shell companies to legitimate business expenses. The more I discovered, the more complex the picture became. Michael hadn't just been hiding an affair. He had been orchestrating a years-long tax evasion scheme, business expenses that never occurred, losses that were manufactured through paper transactions with companies he secretly controlled, income diverted through offshore entities that circled back as consulting fees for services never rendered. The scope was breathtaking, not just in its financial scale, but in its detailed orchestration. This wasn't opportunistic tax avoidance. This was calculated, intentional fraud. And it extended beyond our personal finances to his business operations, potentially putting his clients and employees at risk. I needed expert confirmation before proceeding, someone who could verify my findings without alerting Michael. During our marriage, I had maintained a small network of former colleagues, connections that Michael had dismissed as cute attempts to keep a foot in the professional world. These dismissals had always stung, but now they provided the perfect cover for reaching out without raising suspicion. Emma Richardson had been my roommate during our master's program and now worked as a senior investigator for a financial crimes unit. Our occasional lunches and birthday messages had maintained a connection that proved invaluable. I reached out casually, suggesting a catch-up coffee at a cafe deliberately chosen for its location, far from Michael's usual haunts. Just a friendly review, I told her, sliding a USB drive across the table. I'm thinking about getting back into the field, and I want to make sure my analysis skills haven't completely atrophied. This is a sample case I've been working on, all identifying details removed, of course. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Emma, sharp as always, raised an eyebrow but asked no questions about the true nature of my request. 3 days later, she called from an unknown number. Your skills haven't just remained intact, they've evolved, she said without preamble. The analysis is thorough, methodical, and compelling. If this were a real case, I'd be preparing a referral to the appropriate authorities immediately. The validation was both satisfying and sobering. My suspicions weren't paranoia. They were well-founded conclusions based on concrete evidence. The question now was how to proceed. Traditional divorce would be insufficient. A standard legal separation would likely result in Michael hiding assets, destroying evidence, and potentially leaving me financially vulnerable despite the prenuptial agreement I had signed in what now seemed like another lifetime. More importantly, it would allow him to continue defrauding the government and potentially harm others through his ongoing schemes. No, this required precision, strategy, and patience. The kind of calculated response that Michael had never believed me capable of executing. I created a secured email account using a VPN connection from a public library computer. I purchased a prepaid phone with cash at a convenience store 3 towns away from our home. I established a safe deposit box at a bank where neither of us had ever conducted business. Each step methodical, each precaution necessary. The initial contact with the IRS Criminal Investigation Division was deliberately sparse. Just enough information to establish credibility without revealing my identity or connection to the case. I knew from my background that the IRS received thousands of fraud tips annually. Standing out required providing compelling evidence while protecting my position. Special Agent David Chen responded within 48 hours, a sign that my initial submission had risen above the noise. Our early communications were carefully choreographed, dance of revelation and verification. I provided enough evidence to maintain interest without compromising my safety or future leverage. As trust developed, I gradually expanded the information shared, building a comprehensive picture of Michael's activities. Agent Chen's experience in financial crimes investigation brought new perspectives to my analysis, identifying patterns and connections I had missed. This isn't just tax evasion, he noted during one of our secure calls. There are elements here that suggest money laundering, wire fraud, and potentially even securities violations. The jurisdictional overlap makes this case particularly significant. Before I continue with the details of how my husband's betrayal became his downfall, I want to thank each of you for being here. Your support means everything as I share this journey from devastation to empowerment. If this is your first time, on this channel, we focus on stories of resilience and strategic justice, moments when the underestimated prove their true capability. Consider subscribing to join our community of survivors who refuse to remain victims. Some might view my story as simply a tale of revenge, but it represents something far more significant, a reclamation of power that was systematically denied. What happened between Michael and me reflects patterns that occur in countless relationships, where financial control becomes a tool of domination, where expertise is dismissed based on gender, where dedication to family is weaponized to justify exclusion from financial decisions. The details of my story may be unique, but the underlying dynamics are painfully common. How many of you have had your capabilities questioned or dismissed? How many have discovered that the person who promised to be your partner has been systematically undermining your financial security? The messages I receive daily tell me that these experiences transcend background, education, and circumstance. What I'm about to share isn't just about exposing a cheating husband or recovering stolen funds, though those elements certainly exist. It's about recognizing that justice sometimes requires strategic patience, that reclaiming your power sometimes means using the very skills others have dismissed. Most importantly, it's about understanding that your value isn't determined by someone else's assessment of your worth. As we return to that pivotal moment in the negotiation room, remember that my path there wasn't straightforward or easy. It required confronting painful truths, developing new skills, and ultimately choosing a form of justice that served more than just my personal interests. The table in that hotel conference room represented more than just a meeting place for legal negotiations. It became the stage for a transformation years in the making, the moment when Michael's perception of me collided irrevocably with reality. The woman he had relegated to domestic concerns now controlled the narrative of his professional destruction. His attorney, a silver-haired man whose tailored suit couldn't quite conceal his growing alarm, leaned toward Michael again. "Mr. Sullivan," he whispered urgently, loud enough for me to hear. "We need to request a brief recess to discuss this development." Michael remained frozen, his eyes locked on mine. In that moment, I saw something I had never witnessed in 7 years of marriage: genuine fear. Not the superficial concern he displayed when investments temporarily dropped or when clients wavered, but existential dread as his carefully constructed world began to crumble. Special Agent Chen cleared his throat. "We're prepared to proceed with the presentation of evidence," he stated, opening his briefcase. "Mrs. Sullivan's contributions have been instrumental in piecing together what appears to be a systematic pattern of tax evasion spanning approximately 5 years. Michael's attorney straightened. "My client maintains his innocence of any wrongdoing. We reserve the right to examine the supposed evidence and its source." His emphasis on source carried an implicit threat that my involvement somehow contaminated the investigation. "The source of our evidence ranges from public records to financial disclosures to banking transactions appropriately obtained through legal channels," Agent Chen replied coolly. "Mrs. Sullivan initially brought certain inconsistencies to our attention, but our investigation has been conducted independently and according to all applicable regulations." This was both true and a strategic simplification. My role had been far more substantial than merely flagging inconsistencies, but we had deliberately constructed the narrative to minimize any appearance of personal motivation that might later be used to challenge the findings. As Agent Chen began methodically outlining the case against Michael, I allowed my mind to drift back to the moment this journey truly began, not with the discovery of the affair, but with what I found afterward. The affair had been painful but almost cliché in its predictability. Executive husband, younger secretary, expensive gifts, hidden hotel rendezvous. It followed a script so common it barely deserved mention. What distinguished our situation was what lay beneath that conventional betrayal. I had been reviewing our joint accounts, attempting to understand the financial implications of his infidelity, when I noticed discrepancies in our tax returns. Small inconsistencies at first, deductions that seemed slightly exaggerated, business expenses that didn't align with the calendar of activities I knew intimately as the one who had managed our social and family schedules for years. Digging deeper required access to records that Michael had always insisted on managing personally. "Tax planning is complicated," he would explain with that particular smile that managed to be simultaneously condescending and charming. "You've got enough on your plate managing the household. Let me handle the boring financial details." That division had seemed reasonable when I believed we were partners. Now, it appeared as the deliberate compartmentalization it had always been, a strategy to maintain control while limiting my visibility into our true financial situation. Gaining access required careful planning. Michael's password management was systematic but predictable, following patterns based on significant dates and personal references he believed only he would recognize. What he failed to consider was that the woman who organized every birthday, anniversary, and family event would have intimate knowledge of exactly those reference points. The first password fell easily, his investment account secured with a combination of his father's birthday and the name of his first dog. The second required more finesse, his email protected by a phrase from the college football fight song he still played before important meetings for motivation. Each successful access revealed connections to other accounts, other passwords, other protected information. Within 2 weeks, I had assembled a comprehensive map of our true financial situation. The picture it painted was simultaneously infuriating and terrifying. Our joint assets had been systematically depleted, with funds flowing to accounts I had never known existed. Investment returns that should have been reinvested had been diverted. Tax refunds that should have appeared in our joint account had been redirected. Most disturbingly, I discovered an entirely separate financial identity Michael had constructed. One, where personal expenses were categorized as business deductions, where income was artificially reduced through transactions with shell companies, where losses were manufactured to offset gains that would otherwise be taxable. The complexity suggested this wasn't a recent development triggered by the affair. This was a long-standing system of financial manipulation that had likely predated our marriage. I had not just been betrayed romantically, I had been systematically defrauded by the man who vowed to be my partner. The revelation transformed my emotional response. The personal hurt of his affair faded against the cold reality of his financial betrayal. This wasn't simply about a broken marriage. This was about criminal activity that threatened not just my financial future, but potentially implicated me in tax fraud. I had unknowingly signed joint returns for years. Legal divorce proceedings would likely reveal some financial impropriety, but the discovery process was designed for equitable division of legitimate assets, not the forensic investigation of potential criminal activity. Standard divorce would allow Michael to control the narrative, potentially hide assets, and continue his schemes under a slightly modified structure. The IRS, however, approached financial investigations differently. Their interest wasn't in marital equity, but in uncovering and prosecuting deliberate tax evasion. Their investigators had resources and authority that even the best divorce attorneys couldn't access. Most importantly, they had the power to freeze assets before they could be hidden, transferred, or depleted. My decision to contact them wasn't motivated solely by revenge, though I won't pretend that element was entirely absent. It was a strategic choice that would accomplish multiple objectives: protect my financial future, create consequences for Michael's actions, and potentially help others who might be harmed by his ongoing financial schemes. The initial communication required careful crafting. Too little information would fail to generate interest. Too much might expose my identity prematurely. I created a secure document outlining key indicators of potential fraud, focusing on verifiable discrepancies between reported business activities and actual expenditures. The submission emphasized patterns rather than isolated incidents, systemic issues rather than personal grievances. I used public library computers and VPN connections to submit the information through the IRS whistleblower program, which provides potential financial incentives for tips leading to significant tax recovery. The possibility of eventual compensation was secondary, but provided additional legitimacy to my submission. This wasn't just a vindictive ex-partner, but someone with substantive information offering a potentially valuable lead. The response came faster than anticipated. Within days, I received a secure communication requesting additional information and suggesting a confidential communication channel. Special Agent David Chen introduced himself as the lead investigator assigned to the BI. Initial review, emphasizing that while my information was compelling, substantial verification would be required before formal action could be initiated. Our early exchanges were cautious on both sides, me protecting my identity, him assessing my credibility and motives. I provided additional documentation in carefully measured increments, each release calculated to build trust while maintaining my anonymity. He responded with targeted questions that revealed both his expertise and the seriousness with which the IRS was taking the information. After 3 weeks of secure communications, Agent Chen requested an in-person meeting. This represented a significant escalation and potential risk. Meeting physically would remove a layer of protection, creating vulnerability I had carefully avoided. However, Declining might undermine the credibility I had established and potentially stall the investigation at a critical juncture. The compromise was a meeting in a neighboring state, at a federal building where security protocols would prevent accidental exposure. I created a cover story about visiting a college friend, booked a hotel room under my maiden name using a credit card Michael had no access to, and carefully planned a route that would avoid surveillance or coincidental encounters. The moment that crystallized everything, that transformed my understanding of my marriage and my husband, didn't happen in a dramatic confrontation. It occurred on an ordinary Tuesday evening in our suburban kitchen, with its gleaming granite countertops and professional-grade appliances that Michael had insisted upon during our renovation last year. I stood at the island, chopping vegetables, for a dinner that was scheduled precisely to accommodate Michael's supposedly important client call. The sharp knife moved rhythmically through bell peppers and onions, a domestic task that had become second nature after years of maintaining our home while Michael built his consulting empire. The kitchen embodied the aesthetic perfection Michael demanded in all aspects of our life. Magazine-worthy in its design, meticulously organized, a showpiece that impressed the colleagues and clients he occasionally brought home. Like everything in our carefully curated existence, it projected success and harmony, revealing nothing of the reality beneath the surface. Michael entered from his home office, phone in hand, his expression showing the particular strain that had become familiar over the past few months. Tension around the eyes, a tightness in his jaw that he tried to mask with a practiced smile. "That smells amazing," he said, approaching to place a perfunctory kiss on my cheek. A gesture performed without warmth or genuine connection, a habit rather than an expression of affection. I noted the faint scent of unfamiliar perfume too. Subtle to be obvious, but distinctive enough to register if you were paying attention. And I had been paying very close attention lately. "How was your day?" I asked, continuing the choreography of our marriage, maintaining the performance that had become our relationship. "Productive. Stressful. The Wellington account is becoming complicated." He opened the refrigerator, selected a craft beer from his carefully curated collection. "The clients keep changing parameters, and my team is scrambling to adjust projections." The Wellington account. Another fabrication in a marriage built increasingly on lies. Through my methodical investigation of our finances, I had already discovered that no client by that name existed in his firm's roster. It was simply another placeholder in the elaborate fiction he had constructed. I noticed something strange. "Today?" I said carefully, keeping my tone casual as I scraped chopped vegetables into a waiting pan. "I was trying to make an online payment for the landscaping service, but our joint account seems to have a much lower balance than I expected." Michael's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a flicker of calculation crossing his features before settling back into casual confidence. "Year-end investment reallocation," he explained smoothly. "I moved some funds into a different vehicle that's showing better potential returns. I meant to mention it." The lie flowed easily, practiced. He had delivered similar explanations whenever I noticed financial discrepancies over the years, each time with the same dismissive certainty that preempted further questions. "That makes sense," I replied, matching his casual tone. "I've just been trying to get a better handle on our overall financial picture lately. With all the economic uncertainty in the news, it seems smart to have a clear understanding of where we stand." Michael took a long sip of his beer, studying me over the rim of the glass. Something in my question had triggered his caution. Perhaps because it deviated from our established pattern where he handled all financial matters without interference. "You don't need to worry about all that," he said finally, his tone shifting into what I had come to recognize as his explaining voice, the one he used when simplifying concepts he deemed too complex for my understanding. "The financial systems I've put in place are designed specifically to weather market fluctuations. It's complicated stuff. Tax optimization strategies, investment vehicles with contingent returns, diversification across multiple risk categories." He set his beer down and leaned against the counter, assuming the posture of benevolent authority that had once seemed protective, but now felt suffocating. That's why we have our division of responsibilities, Rachel. You manage the household brilliantly, and I handle the financial planning. It's what I'm trained for, after all. I continued stirring the vegetables, fighting to keep my expression neutral despite the condescension dripping from every word. I know it's your expertise, I conceded. But I did have that finance background before we met. I might understand. More than you think. Michael laughed, a short, dismissive sound that fell between us like a declaration. That introductory accounting course during your business degree hardly qualifies as a finance background, sweetheart. What I'm handling involves complex tax strategies and investment structures that require years of specialized knowledge. The casual erasure of my educational history, the deliberate minimization of my master's degree in accounting and my pre-marriage career, wasn't new. It was simply the most recent instance in a pattern of systematic diminishment that had characterized our relationship from the beginning. Actually, I had nearly finished my CPA certification when I began, only to be interrupted by the deliberate sound of his phone ringing. Michael glanced at the screen. It's Wellington. I have to take this. He stepped out of the kitchen without waiting for a response, his voice shifting immediately into his professional register as he answered the call from the non-existent client. I remained at the stove, the forgotten vegetables beginning to char slightly at the edges. That moment clarified everything, not because it was particularly dramatic or unusual, but precisely because it wasn't. It was the casual, everyday dismissal that had become so routine I had almost stopped noticing. The discovery of his affair had been painful but almost beside the point. The systematic financial betrayal had been infuriating, but somehow expected. But this routine dismissal of my capabilities, this casual erasure of my intelligence and expertise, this was the true nature of our marriage revealed in its most honest form. Michael didn't just lie about his activities or hide his financial manipulations. He fundamentally dismissed my capacity to understand them. His entire strategy depended on my acceptance of a role he had assigned me. The capable homemaker with no head for complex financial matters. The supportive wife who couldn't possibly comprehend the sophisticated methods he employed to build our future. That dismissal was the foundation upon which he had built every other deception. It wasn't just that he believed he could hide his affair. He believed I wouldn't be capable of understanding the financial trails it created. It wasn't just that he thought he could divert our assets. He was convinced I wouldn't have the skills to track the movements. It wasn't just that he had constructed elaborate tax fraud schemes. He was certain I lacked the expertise to recognize them. His entire criminal enterprise operated on a single core assumption, that I was exactly what he had decided I was. Nothing more, nothing less. I turned down the heat under the pan and took a deep breath. Something settled within me. Not rage, not hurt, but a cold, clear certainty. I would not just expose his betrayal. I would systematically dismantle the assumptions that enabled it. I would use the very expertise he dismissed to construct his downfall with the same methodical precision he had used to construct his fraud. 2 days later, I found myself in our home office during Michael's extended business lunch. Another, thinly disguised rendezvous with his mistress. I had already accessed his primary computer using passwords I'd carefully collected, but had discovered it contained only the sanitized financial records he expected others might eventually see. Thorotai. Real evidence would be elsewhere, likely on the encrypted external drive he kept locked in his desk drawer. The lock wasn't sophisticated. It yielded easily to the small set of pics I had ordered online and practiced with for weeks, preparing for exactly this moment. The drive contained exactly what I expected: parallel financial records showing the true state of our affairs. Tax returns with 2 versions: the official documents filed with the IRS and the accurate calculations showing actual income and expenses. spreadsheets tracking movements between legitimate accounts and shell companies, documentation of property purchases made through obscured ownership structures. Most damning were the emails between Michael and his private banker, discussing strategies for moving assets offshore in ways that would be untraceable in the event of personal complications. A thinly veiled reference to potential divorce proceedings. As I methodically copied the files, careful to leave no digital fingerprints, I felt no triumph, no vindication, only a profound sense of clarity. The husband who had belittled my financial acumen, who had treated my intelligence as a quaint but limited resource, had inadvertently provided me with everything needed to bring his carefully constructed world crashing down. That evening, as we sat across from each other at our dining table, Michael talked extensively about a business conference he planned to attend the following month. He described the networking opportunities, the potential client acquisitions, the strategic partnerships that might develop. He explained how the expanded business would secure our financial future, how his vision would ensure prosperity long into our retirement years. I smiled, asked appropriate questions, appeared suitably impressed by his business acumen and strategic thinking. The performance was flawless on both sides, he believing he was sharing his professional world with an admiring spouse, me knowing that within weeks, that world would no longer exist. His dismissal of my capabilities had created the perfect blind spot. He couldn't conceive that the woman serving perfectly cooked salmon across the table had spent the afternoon documenting his federal crimes. He couldn't imagine that the wife, nodding appreciatively at his business strategies, was developing strategies of her own, more sophisticated, more comprehensive, and ultimately more devastating than anything in his limited imagination. "You're incredible," I told him, raising my wine glass in a toast that he eagerly reciprocated, basking in what he perceived as admiration. "I don't know how you manage to keep track of all these complex business dealings." "It's all about systems," he replied, his expression settling into the familiar pattern of benevolent condescension. "Creating structures that organize complexity into manageable components." "I'd love to understand more about how that works," I said, testing the boundaries of his assumptions about me. His smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Trust me, Rachel, you'd find it tediously boring. You're brilliant with people, with creating the perfect home environment. We each have our strengths. That's what makes us work so well together." In that moment, as he casually reinforced the key limitations he had assigned me, I felt something shift. The last lingering doubt about my planned course of action dissolving completely. This wasn't just about recovering stolen assets or exposing infidelity. This was about dismantling a fundamental injustice that extended far beyond our marriage. The dismissal reflected in his condescending smile deserved a response equivalent to its magnitude, and I was now positioned to deliver exactly that. The following morning, I woke before sunrise. Michael slept beside me, his breathing deep and regular, completely unaware that everything had changed. I slipped from the bed carefully, not wanting to disturb what would be one of his last peaceful nights of sleep. The house was silent as I made my way to the kitchen. I prepared coffee with the same methodical precision I would soon apply to dismantling Michael's life, each step measured, each movement purposeful. The familiar routine provided a framework for the unprecedented thoughts forming in my mind. I sat at the breakfast nook, watching dawn gradually illuminate our manicured backyard. The property that had once represented our shared success now stood as evidence of Michael's financial manipulations. The extensive landscaping, the custom swimming pool, the outdoor kitchen, all financed through funds diverted from our legitimate accounts and obscured through a web of falsified business expenses. Where another woman might have felt rage or collapsed in grief, I experienced something different. A crystalline clarity that transformed emotional chaos into strategic calculation. The betrayal was complete, the evidence undeniable, the path forward suddenly evident with remarkable precision. Most people expected emotional reactions to devastating revelations. They anticipated tears, confrontations, the messy explosion of accumulated hurt and betrayal. Michael certainly would. His entire strategy depended on emotion clouding judgment, on hurt feelings overwhelming rational analysis. But sitting in the quiet morning light, I didn't feel the expected tidal wave of emotion. Instead, I felt something solidifying within me, a cold, clear certainty that transcended personal hurt. This wasn't just about a betrayed wife or a broken marriage. This was about justice, accountability, and the systematic correction of a profound imbalance. I opened my laptop and created a new document. At the top, I typed Strategic Response Framework and began methodically outlining categories: evidence collection, asset protection, professional network activation, legal considerations, timeline management. Under each heading, I developed detailed action items, consideration factors, and potential contingencies. This wasn't a revenge plan. Revenge was emotional, reactive, ultimately unsatisfying. What I was constructing was fundamentally different. A comprehensive strategy designed not just to expose Michael's crimes, but to ensure that the systems that had enabled them would no longer protect him. The fundamental question wasn't, how do I hurt Michael? But rather, how do I ensure complete accountability while protecting my interests? The distinction was crucial. One path led to mutually assured destruction, the other to strategic resolution. By the time Michael came downstairs, showered, and dressed for work, I had completed the initial framework and closed my laptop. He found me preparing his favorite breakfast, a domestic task that now served as tactical camouflage. "You're up early," he observed, accepting the coffee I offered. "Couldn't sleep," I replied with a carefully calibrated smile that suggested mild concern rather than seismic revelation. Thinking about redecorating the guest room. His relief was almost palpable. Domestic concerns represented familiar territory, reinforcing his perception of me as focused exclusively on home and family matters. "Whatever you think best," he said, his attention already shifting to his phone. "You always make the right choices with that stuff." As he skimmed emails and messages, completely oblivious to the transformation occurring before him, I felt an almost academic fascination with his blindness. The cognitive dissonance required to sit across from someone you've systematically betrayed, to accept their care while dismantling their financial security, to maintain the fiction of partnership while engaging in profound deception. It was remarkable in its pathology. "I'll be late tonight," he said, gathering his things. "The Hamilton project has some complications we need to address." Another lie. Another fictional client, another evening that would likely be spent with his mistress while fraudulent business. Expenses accumulated. "I'll keep dinner warm," I replied, playing my assigned role flawlessly. The domestic promise, maintaining the comfortable home he would return to after his deceptions, was particularly ironic given what I had set in motion. After Michael left, I immediately began implementing the first phase of my strategic plan. The initial step wasn't dramatic, but foundational, creating secure communications channels that would be undetectable to Michael. I purchased a prepaid phone with cash from a convenience store 30 miles from our home, one without security cameras at the register. I established new email accounts using public computers at different libraries throughout the county, each account created with carefully constructed false information that couldn't be traced to me. I rented a small safety deposit box at a bank where neither of us had accounts, using my maiden name and alternate identification. These weren't the actions of someone lashing out in pain. They were the calculated moves of someone constructing an independent operational framework, creating secure channels, establishing resource caches, building communication infrastructure that existed entirely outside Michael's awareness or control. By early afternoon, I had completed the security foundations and moved to the second phase, strategic evidence collection. The copies I had already made of Michael's financial records provided a comprehensive overview of his fraudulent activities, but successful accountability would require more than just documentation. I needed context, patterns, supporting evidence that would transform isolated documents into a compelling narrative of systematic fraud. Most importantly, I needed to establish clear separation between our financial activities to protect myself from potential implication in his crimes. The joint tax returns we had filed created particular vulnerability. As a co-signer, I could, theoretically, be held liable for the fraudulent claims they contained. Demonstrating that I had been deliberately excluded from the true financial information, that my signature had been effectively obtained under false pretenses, would be essential to protecting my legal and financial position. I began constructing a detailed timeline correlating Michael's documented financial manipulations with his representations to me about our financial status. Email exchanges where I had asked financial questions and received misleading responses. Text messages referencing joint financial decisions that had actually been unilateral actions by Michael. Calendar entries showing I had been elsewhere during transactions supposedly conducted jointly. The picture that emerged was comprehensive and damning, not just of Michael's financial crimes, but of the systematic deception he had employed within our marriage to facilitate them. The evidence didn't just demonstrate tax fraud, it illustrated the calculated exploitation of marital trust to enable that fraud. By late afternoon, I had assembled enough preliminary documentation to move to the next phase, strategic outreach, to select professionals who could provide specialized guidance while maintaining absolute confidentiality. The first contact was Clara Jennings, a forensic accountant I had known during my pre-marriage career. We had maintained occasional professional contact through industry conferences and LinkedIn connections, exactly the type of relationship Michael dismissed as irrelevant to our lives. I messaged her using one of my new secure accounts, requesting an urgent consultation on a sensitive financial matter requiring specialized expertise. The deliberately vague phrasing would signal the need for discretion without revealing details prematurely. Her response came within hours, professional, measured, offering a consultation slot the following day at her office in the financial district. The location was perfect, a building housing dozens of financial services firms where I could enter without attracting attention or creating records that might later be discovered. The second contact was more delicate. Marcus Whitman, an attorney specializing in both tax law and criminal defense. We had no previous relationship, but his reputation for discretion and expertise in cases involving financial crimes made him the optimal consultant for my situation. The approach here required additional security measures. Rather than direct contact, I routed my inquiry through a professional referral service that specialized in connecting clients with appropriate legal representation for sensitive matters. The service's confidentiality protocols would provide an additional layer of security against premature exposure of my plans. By evening, both meetings were arranged for the following day, scheduled with sufficient time between them to process information from the first consultation before engaging in the second. The timing was deliberate, creating a strategic sequence that would allow each expert's input to inform my approach with the other. As I prepared dinner that Michael would never eat, maintaining the domestic facade that now served a tactical purpose, I felt an unfamiliar sensation beneath the strategic calculation. Not quite satisfaction, not exactly anticipation, but a profound sense of alignment. For the first time in years, perhaps in our entire marriage, I was fully engaging my actual capabilities rather than the limited version Michael had assigned me. The woman chopping vegetables and marinating chicken was simultaneously constructing a legal and financial strategy of remarkable sophistication. The wife preparing to maintain the fiction of normal domestic life was concurrently preparing to dismantle the actual foundations of that life. The supposedly financial naïf was developing approaches to complex tax and legal questions that would soon impress seasoned professionals in those fields. When Michael texted that he wouldn't make it home for dinner after all, citing a client, emergency that I knew was fabricated, I responded with appropriate wifely concern and understanding. His reply included a heart emoji and the message, "Don't know what I'd do without you." The irony wasn't lost on me. He would soon find out exactly what he would do without me, and without his freedom, his reputation, his assets, and his carefully constructed fiction of respectability. But that revelation would come precisely when I determined it should, not a moment before. I saved the dinner in carefully labeled containers, documenting this mundane domestic act with the same attention to detail I was applying to every other aspect of my strategic response. Even this, the maintenance of normal household routines, was now part of a larger design, creating both evidence of my continued participation in marital life and tactical cover for my parallel activities. As night fell, I reviewed my strategic framework, updating action items and refining timelines based on the day's progress. Tomorrow would bring expert consultations that would further shape my approach. The path forward was becoming increasingly clear, not a frantic escape or an emotional confrontation, but a precisely engineered dismantling of everything Michael had built through deception. My meeting with Clara Jennings was scheduled for 10 a.m. at her office in the gleaming glass tower that housed several prestigious financial firms. I arrived 30 minutes early, taking a circuitous route that included switching taxis and briefly entering and exiting a department store, small precautions that had become second nature over the past few days. The lobby directory listed dozens of companies across 38 floors. Clara's firm, Meridian Financial Forensics, occupied the entire 22nd floor, a testament to their reputation and success in the specialized field of forensic accounting. I had dressed strategically for this meeting, a conservative gray, suit that projected professional competence rather than the carefully curated casual elegance Michael preferred me to display. My hair was pulled back in a simple style, makeup minimal but precise. Everything about my appearance was designed to signal that I was a professional seeking professional services, not a distressed spouse looking for emotional support. The elevator opened directly into Meridian's reception area, all sleek lines and muted colors designed to convey both discretion and authority. The receptionist greeted me with practiced neutrality, requesting identification before announcing my arrival. I provided my driver's license showing my maiden name, another deliberate choice that would prevent any immediate connection to Michael. Clara appeared moments later, her expression warming with recognition. "Rachel," she said, extending her hand. "It's been too long. Please, come this way." She led me through the office to a conference room with frosted glass walls, visible enough to seem transparent, opaque enough to ensure privacy. A subtle signal on a panel near the door turned the glass completely opaque as we entered. "Standard privacy protocol," Clara explained. "Once activated, it also engages sound dampening and electronic countermeasures." She gestured to the comfortable chairs surrounding a polished conference table. "How can I help you today?" I placed a sealed envelope on the table. "Before we begin, I need to establish privilege and confidentiality. This retainer should cover initial consultation and preliminary analysis." Clara nodded, understanding immediately the seriousness of whatever had brought me here. She opened the envelope, confirmed the contents, and signed a receipt that she then passed to me. "With that established," she said, her tone shifting from friendly to professionally focused, "what brings you to Meridian?" "I need a forensic analysis of potentially fraudulent financial activities," I replied, placing a USB drive on the table. "And I need absolute certainty about my own exposure or liability related to these activities." Clara picked up the drive, turning it thoughtfully in her fingers. "May I ask about the nature of your relationship to the subject of this investigation?" "He's my husband," I said simply. "And he's been systematically defrauding both me and the federal government for at least 5 years." If Clara was surprised by this direct statement, she didn't show it. Her expression remained professionally neutral as she connected the drive to a standalone computer, one specifically designated for reviewing sensitive materials, isolated from networks that might be compromised. "I'll need to review the contents. Before we proceed further," she said, "would you prefer to wait here or in our client lounge?" "I'll wait here," I replied. The client lounge would likely have other people, potential witnesses to my presence. The conference room offered complete privacy. Clara nodded and began reviewing the files. Her expression remained impassive, but I noticed subtle tells as she progressed through the documents: a slight narrowing of the eyes, an occasional pause to make notes, a barely perceptible shake of the head at particularly egregious examples. After 20 minutes of silent review, she looked up. "This is extensive," she said, her tone measured, "and sophisticated in its execution. You've already done considerable analysis yourself." It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. "I have a master's degree in accounting with a specialization in forensic analysis. I worked for Deloitte before my marriage." Something shifted in Clara's expression. Not quite surprise, but reassessment. "I remember you were at Deloitte, but I didn't realize your specialization was forensic." "Few people do," I replied. "My husband certainly doesn't. Or rather, he's deliberately chosen to forget." Clara nodded, understanding the implications. "That actually works in your favor legally. The disparity between your actual qualifications and his representation of your financial acumen strengthens the case for deliberate concealment rather than co-conspiracy." She turned back to the computer, navigating through additional files. "What you've assembled here is remarkably comprehensive. The connection between personal expenses mischaracterized as business deductions, the manufactured losses through related party transactions, the manipulated basis calculations. It's all documented with exceptional precision." "I've had access to his records for approximately 3 weeks," I explained. "I've been working primarily between midnight and 4 a.m. when he's sleeping to avoid detection." Clara looked up again, her professional detachment momentarily giving way to genuine admiration. "That's impressive dedication and methodical execution." "I had significant motivation," I replied simply. She nodded and returned to the files, focusing now on a different category of documents. "These transfers to offshore entities. Have you been able to trace their ultimate destination?" "Partially," I said, pointing to a specific folder on the drive. "The initial transfers go to a series of shell companies in the Cayman Islands, but I've traced secondary movements to accounts in Liechtenstein and Singapore. I haven't been able to access the final destination accounts, but the pattern suggests a layered approach designed to obscure ownership while maintaining eventual access." Clara studied me for a moment. "Most clients come to us with suspicions and fragments. You've brought a nearly complete forensic analysis." "I need verification from recognized experts," I explained. "My analysis alone, given my relationship to the subject, could be dismissed as biased or vindictive. Your firm's reputation provides independent credibility." "A valid strategic consideration," Clara agreed. She closed the files and removed the drive. "Based on my preliminary review, I can tell you 3 things with confidence. First, the evidence of fraudulent financial activity is substantial and compelling. Second, the patterns indicate systematic rather than opportunistic behavior, suggesting premeditation and intent. Third, your documentation of your exclusion from these activities is sufficiently comprehensive to establish your position as an unwitting participant rather than a co-conspirator." She leaned forward slightly. "What exactly do you hope to achieve with this information, Rachel?" The question was direct, professional rather than judgmental. It deserved an equally direct answer. "Complete accountability," I replied. "I want the appropriate authorities to have everything they need to fully prosecute the criminal activities. I want to ensure my own legal and financial protection from both the consequences of his actions and any retaliatory measures he might take." and I want to prevent him from continuing these patterns with future victims. Clara nodded, accepting the clarity of my objectives. Those are achievable goals, given the quality of evidence you've assembled. We can provide the expert verification and additional analysis you're seeking, as well as guidance on appropriate authorities for different aspects of the case. She paused, considering something. There's an additional aspect you may not have considered. The IRS whistleblower program provides financial incentives for information that leads to the recovery of significant unpaid taxes. Based on what I've seen here, the amounts involved would qualify for substantial compensation, typically between 15% and 30% of the collected amounts. I hadn't considered this aspect. My primary motivation was accountability, not financial gain. But the potential whistleblower compensation could provide additional security during what would likely be a turbulent period ahead. That would be a secondary consideration, I said, but potentially useful for establishing financial independence during legal proceedings. Exactly, Clara agreed. Now, let's discuss next steps. I recommend a full forensic analysis by our team, focusing particularly on strengthening the documentation of your exclusion from financial decisions. We should also prepare separate analyses for different potential authorities: IRS Criminal Investigation Division for tax issues, FBI for potential wire fraud, SEC for securities violations if his business activities involve regulated investments. She outlined a proposed timeline and fee structure for these services, emphasizing the importance of maintaining absolute confidentiality throughout the process. Given the sophistication of the schemes involved, we should assume the subject has resources and connections that could compromise standard communications. I've already established secure communication protocols, I assured her. Separate devices, encrypted channels, physical document exchange when necessary. Clara's expression showed that professional reassessment again. You've been remarkably thorough in your preparations. I learned from watching him, I replied. The same attention to detail he applied to constructing these schemes, I'm now applying to deconstructing them. Our meeting concluded with specific arrangements for secure file transfers and follow-up consultations. As I prepared to leave, Clara offered one final observation. In my experience, people who engage in financial fraud at this level believe themselves to be exceptional, smarter than the system, immune to normal consequences. That belief creates a particular type of vulnerability, an inability to recognize when they're outmatched. Your husband has significantly underestimated his opponent. Yes, I agreed, gathering my things. He has. My second meeting of the day, with attorney Marcus Whitman, built upon the foundation established with Clara. The legal consultation provided additional dimensions to my strategic approach, focusing on jurisdictional considerations, potential criminal charges, and strategic timing for evidence presentation. Marcus was initially more reserved than Clara, approaching my case with professional caution until he had reviewed the evidence thoroughly. By the end of our 2-hour consultation, that caution had transformed into strategic alignment. The comprehensiveness of your documentation creates unusual advantages, he noted during our discussion of potential approaches. Typically, in cases involving spousal financial crimes, establishing the innocent spouse's lack of knowledge or participation requires extensive after-the-fact investigation. You've already assembled what amounts to a complete defense file before any charges have even been filed. As I left his office with a detailed legal strategy outline and formal representation agreement, I felt something I hadn't experienced since discovering Michael's betrayal. A sense of reclaiming control, not just over my immediate circumstances, but over my future trajectory. The woman who had once accepted Michael's dismissal of her financial capabilities had spent the day engaging with top professionals in their fields as a peer, contributing substantive analysis that earned their respect. Rather than their sympathy, the transformation wasn't recent or reactive. It was the emergence of capabilities that had always existed, merely hidden beneath the constraints Michael had imposed and I had temporarily accepted. As I returned home that evening, I moved seamlessly, back into the role Michael expected, the supportive wife focused on domestic matters, apparently oblivious to his financial manipulations and personal betrayals. The performance required minimal effort. I had been playing this character for years. Michael returned home late, offering the expected excuses about client meetings and project complications. I responded with appropriate interest and concern, maintaining the fiction that sustained our marriage and now served my strategic purposes. He spoke about his day, elaborating on fictional client interactions and business challenges. I experienced a peculiar form of double awareness, simultaneously engaging with the surface conversation while cataloging each fabrication as potential evidence. The skills I had developed in my previous professional life, temporarily redirected to maintaining our home, were now fully reactivated and focused on systematically dismantling the deception that had defined our relationship. Later, as Michael slept beside me, I reflected on the day's developments. The foundations I had established, secure communications, professional alliances, verified evidence, legal protections, were invisible but substantial. Like the hidden foundations of a building, they existed beneath the surface, unknown to casual observers but essential to supporting what would soon be constructed above. Michael's betrayal had been built on the assumption of my limitations. My response would be built on capabilities he had never bothered to recognize: patience, strategic thinking, forensic analysis, and the relentless pursuit of accountability. The hidden foundation was now in place. The next phases would be built upon it with the same methodical precision. The weeks that followed took on a distinct rhythm, a carefully choreographed balance between maintaining the facade of normal married life and meticulously building the case that would ultimately dismantle it. Each day required precise time management and unwavering attention to detail. My mornings belonged to Michael and the performance of our marriage. I prepared his breakfast, maintained light conversation about household matters and social obligations, asked appropriate questions about his work while appearing to accept his simplified explanations. This daily routine served dual purposes: maintaining his confidence in my ignorance while providing opportunities to collect additional evidence of his ongoing deceptions. Each casual mention of a client meeting became a data point to be verified against his actual whereabouts. Every reference to a business expense became an item to cross-reference against financial records. The domestic conversations he considered trivial were, in fact, carefully structured intelligence-gathering operations. The hours while Michael was at work, or claimed to be at work, became my primary operational time. I divided these periods into specific functional blocks, each dedicated to particular aspects of my developing strategy. Documentation and evidence collection remained the foundation. I established a secure digital vault using military-grade encryption, accessible only through authentication methods that couldn't be traced back to me. Every financial record, every inconsistent statement, every documented lie was categorized, cross-referenced, and preserved with chain-of-custody protocols that would withstand legal scrutiny. Communication with my growing network of professional allies required particular caution. I never contacted Clara or Marcus from home, never used devices connected to our household network, never left paper trails that might alert Michael to my activities. Meeting locations rotated regularly, follow-up communications used encrypted channels, and physical documents were exchanged using secure drop protocols adapted from corporate espionage countermeasures. Financial preparation became increasingly critical as my timeline developed. I needed resources that Michael couldn't access, monitor, or control, funds that would sustain me through what would likely be a protracted legal process. I began liquidating personal assets that predated our marriage: jewelry inherited from my grandmother, investments established before we met, artwork purchased with funds from my early career. Each liquidation was conducted carefully to avoid triggering financial alerts that might reach Michael. Cash was converted to bearer instruments, digital currencies, or physical assets that could be easily transported but wouldn't immediately appear on traditional financial radar. I established accounts under my maiden name at institutions where Michael had no connections or relationships. The most challenging aspect was psychological preparation. Dismantling a marriage, even one built on fundamental deception, creates emotional aftershocks that can compromise strategic thinking if not properly managed. I dedicated specific time to processing the complex emotions that surfaced, not to indulge them, but to acknowledge and contain them so they wouldn't interfere with necessary actions. I maintained a private journal, stored through encrypted cloud services, where I documented my authentic reactions to each discovery, each confirmation of betrayal, each moment when the full scope of Michael's deception became clearer. This served both as emotional processing and as contemporaneous documentation of my evolving understanding. Evidence that could later demonstrate my transition from unwitting spouse to informed whistleblower. Late nights became research sessions dedicated to understanding the legal and financial landscape I was navigating. I studied IRS whistleblower procedures, reviewed case histories of successful tax fraud prosecutions, analyzed precedents involving innocent spouse protections. Knowledge became another form of currency in my preparation, each insight providing additional strategic options. Clara's team at Meridian Financial Forensics became an essential resource during this period. Their comprehensive analysis of the evidence I had provided yielded additional insights into the structure of Michael's fraudulent activities. Weekly secure briefings with their senior forensic accountants helped refine my understanding of the mechanisms he had employed and the potential vulnerabilities in his systems. The pattern suggests increased risk-taking over time, Clara noted during one consultation, reviewing timeline analysis that showed progressively larger fraudulent transactions. This acceleration is typical in sustained financial fraud. Early success creates overconfidence, leading to expanded activities and reduced caution. This observation proved valuable in prioritizing evidence collection. The most recent transactions, where Michael had grown more aggressive and potentially less careful, provided the clearest documentation of criminal intent and methodical execution. Marcus Whitman's legal guidance focused on preparing for multiple potential scenarios. "We need to be ready for various response patterns," he advised during a secure meeting at his firm's secondary office location. "If the IRS moves quickly based on your evidence, we need a synchronized strategy for divorce proceedings that leverages those developments without compromising the federal investigation." His team developed contingency plans for different prosecutorial approaches, potential defensive strategies Michael might employ, and various asset protection mechanisms that could be implemented as the case developed. The comprehensive legal framework they constructed provided a roadmap for navigating the complex intersection of criminal prosecution, civil divorce proceedings, and financial recovery actions. Throughout this preparation phase, I maintained obsessive attention to operational security. Michael's technical sophistication meant I couldn't risk standard approaches to communication or documentation. I purchased electronics with cash, used public Wi-Fi networks accessed through anonymizing services, and employed counter-surveillance techniques when meeting with my growing team of professional allies. Physical security required similar caution. I began regular visits to a gym across town, establishing a pattern that wouldn't raise suspicions while creating opportunities to meet contacts away from potential observation. I volunteered at a community center that happened to be in the same building as a private mail service where I received sensitive communications. Each movement served multiple purposes, creating both legitimate cover for my activities and operational opportunities to advance my strategy. As weeks became months, the scope of evidence grew exponentially. What had begun as documentation of personal financial betrayal expanded into comprehensive mapping of a sophisticated criminal enterprise. Michael's fraudulent activities extended beyond our personal finances into his business operations, client relationships, and investment structures. The most disturbing discovery came through Clara's specialized team focused on business analysis. They identified a pattern suggesting Michael had been leveraging client information for personal gain, potentially using confidential data from his consulting clients to inform investment decisions, a form of insider trading that added securities fraud to the growing list of potential charges. This significantly changes the jurisdictional landscape, Marcus explained when I brought this evidence to his attention. Securities violations bring the SEC into play alongside the IRS and potentially the FBI. Multiple federal agencies create both challenges and opportunities for our approach. The mounting evidence required increasingly sophisticated organization systems. I developed a secure database that mapped relationships between entities, transactions, communications, and timeline events. The visual representation revealed patterns that might otherwise have remained obscured, connections between seemingly unrelated activities, temporal relationships that suggested coordination, recurring methods that demonstrated systematic approach rather than isolated incidents. Throughout this intensive preparation period, I maintained the external appearance of normalcy with remarkable discipline. I attended social functions with Michael, managed household responsibilities, participated in family events, all while systematically assembling the evidence that would ultimately destroy the life we had supposedly built together. Michael remained completely unaware, his confidence in my ignorance so complete that he never questioned my activities or expressions. The emotional distance that had characterized our marriage for years became an unexpected asset. He had long ago stopped paying genuine attention to my thoughts, interests, or activities beyond their relevance to his needs and image. His dismissal of my capabilities had created the perfect operational environment for my preparations. The woman he believed capable only of managing domestic matters was methodically constructing a case that would withstand federal scrutiny. The wife he had reduced to a supporting character in his life story was authoring a completely different narrative, one where his criminal activities would receive the full attention of multiple regulatory and law enforcement agencies. By the end of the third month, my preparation had reached a critical threshold. The evidence was comprehensive, the professional network fully established, the financial safeguards implemented, the strategic approach refined through multiple consultations with experts in relevant fields. A secure meeting with Clara, Marcus, and their respective senior team members marked the transition from preparation to activation. The documentation is exceptional, Clara confirmed, reviewing the final analysis package her team had prepared. The evidence establishes clear patterns of deliberate tax evasion, wire fraud, and potential securities violations. The timeline demonstrates systematic activity rather than isolated incidents, and the financial impact exceeds thresholds for criminal rather than civil prosecution. Marcus nodded agreement. From a legal perspective, we've established multiple layers of protection for your position. The evidence of your exclusion from financial decision-making is compelling. The documentation of your discovery process is chronologically sound, and your cooperation approach aligns with established innocent spouse protocols. Then we're ready? For the next phase, I said, not as a question but as confirmation. The methodical preparation had transformed abstract plans into concrete reality. What had begun as a response to personal betrayal had evolved into a comprehensive case that would likely become a significant federal prosecution. The systems were in place, the evidence secured, the strategies defined. The time had come to move from preparation to action. My initial contact with the IRS Criminal Investigation Division was deliberately understated. A secure online submission through their whistleblower portal that provided enough substantive information to warrant attention, without revealing my full hand. The submission included sample documentation of clear tax fraud, carefully selected to demonstrate both the significance of the case and the credibility of the source. I used a public library computer in a neighboring county to submit the information. Having thoroughly researched the facility beforehand to confirm the absence of security cameras that might record my presence, the submission included an anonymous email address for follow-up communications, one created specifically for this purpose using privacy protections that would prevent tracing. The calculated risk in this approach was precisely calibrated. Enough information to generate genuine interest from investigators. Not enough to allow Michael to identify the source if he somehow became aware of the inquiry. Each document had been scrubbed of metadata that might contain identifying information, each example chosen to demonstrate pattern without revealing my comprehensive understanding of his operations. 3 days after the submission, the anonymous email account received its first response, a standardized acknowledgement from the IRS whistleblower office, indicating the information had been received and was under preliminary review. The message included a case reference number and secure protocols for further communication. This seemingly minor development represented a significant tactical victory. The assignment of a case number confirmed that my submission had cleared the initial screening and was now within the formal IRS evaluation system. The secure communication protocols would allow for progressive disclosure of additional evidence without compromising my identity. My response to this opening was measured and strategic. I provided a second batch of documentation that expanded upon the initial submission, additional examples of fraudulent deductions, clear evidence of income concealment, and documentation of a shell company structure used to fabricate business losses. This calibrated escalation was designed to demonstrate that the source possessed substantial information beyond the initial disclosure. The IRS response came more quickly this time. Within 24 hours, a message arrived indicating the case had been assigned to a special agent for further investigation. The message included a request for a secure communication channel for more detailed exchange of information. This development accelerated my timeline but didn't fundamentally alter it. Marcus had predicted that a case of this magnitude, with clear documentation of systematic fraud, would likely trigger assignment to the Criminal Investigation Division rather than Civil Compliance units. The rapid response simply confirmed the effectiveness of my initial approach. I consulted with Marcus before responding, ensuring our next steps aligned with both immediate tactical objectives and longer-term strategic positioning. His guidance was clear. Establish the secure communication channel, but maintain anonymous status while gradually increasing the substantive information provided. The transition from anonymous tipster to identified cooperating witness needs to happen at precisely the right moment, he advised during our secure consultation. Too early, and you lose leverage and protection. Too late, and you risk appearing reluctant, which could compromise credibility. Following this guidance, I established encrypted communication with the assigned special agent, David Chen, an investigator with the IRS Criminal Investigation Division who specialized in complex financial fraud cases. Our initial exchanges maintained my anonymity while establishing the scope and significance of Michael's fraudulent activities. Agent Chen's approach was professional and methodical. His questions focused on verifying the authenticity of documents I had provided, establishing the mechanisms of the fraudulent schemes, and determining the full financial scope of the evasion. Each query revealed both his investigative expertise and the seriousness with which the IRS was treating the case. My responses were equally measured, providing comprehensive answers that demonstrated detailed knowledge while carefully avoiding information that would prematurely reveal my identity or relationship to Michael. The communication pattern established a foundation of credibility and competence that would prove valuable in later phases. After 2 weeks of increasingly detailed exchanges, Agent Chen proposed an in-person meeting to discuss potential formal cooperation. This represented both opportunity and risk. Direct interaction would significantly advance the investigation, but would necessarily compromise my anonymity. The timing aligned with my strategic framework. The preliminary investigation had progressed sufficiently to establish the legitimacy of the case, but not so far that my identity as the primary source had become irrelevant. It was the optimal moment to transition from anonymous tipster to formal cooperating witness. After consultation with both Marcus and Clara, I agreed to the meeting with specific conditions: a neutral location outside our immediate region, assurances of confidentiality, and the presence of my legal counsel. Agent Chen accepted these terms without hesitation, understanding the sensitivity of the situation. The meeting location, a federal building in a city 3 hours from our home, was selected specifically for its security protocols and absence of connection to either Michael's business activities or our personal lives. Marcus accompanied me as legal counsel, his presence providing both professional guidance and additional credibility to my position. The 4-hour meeting with Agent Chen and his supervisor transformed the investigation from preliminary inquiry to formal case development. I provided comprehensive documentation of Michael's fraudulent activities, tax returns with false deductions, bank records showing income diversion, evidence of shell companies used for artificial loss generation, and documentation of my own exclusion from these financial decisions. This is one of the most thoroughly documented initial presentations I've encountered in 15 years of financial investigations, Agent Chen's supervisor noted after reviewing the materials. The organization and analysis reflect professional-level understanding of both tax requirements and forensic documentation. I have a master's degree in accounting with specialization in forensic analysis, I explained, revealing my professional background for the first time. Before my marriage, I worked for Deloitte in their Financial Advisory Services division. This disclosure visibly shifted their assessment, not just of the evidence, but of me as a witness. The sophisticated analysis they had attributed to professional assistance was suddenly contextualized as the work of someone with relevant expertise deliberately applying their skills to documenting criminal activity. "And your husband is unaware of your background?" Agent Chen asked, the implications immediately clear to him. "He knows about my education and early career," I clarified. "But he has systematically dismissed and diminished that background, treating it as irrelevant to our financial management. His perception of me as financially unsophisticated is central to how he's maintained these fraudulent activities within our marriage." The remainder of the meeting focused on establishing formal cooperation parameters. Agent Chen outlined the investigative process moving forward, the potential timeline for enforcement actions, and the protections available to me as a cooperating witness. Marcus ensured that innocent spouse provisions were explicitly addressed, securing preliminary confirmation that the evidence clearly established my exclusion from the fraudulent activities. As the meeting concluded, I provided a final piece of critical information: details about upcoming financial transactions Michael had scheduled that would move substantial assets offshore through his established laundering channels. This time-sensitive intelligence would allow the IRS to observe and document active fraud rather than relying solely on historical evidence. This creates an opportunity for real-time surveillance and potential intervention, Agent Chen noted, immediately recognizing the strategic value of the information. It significantly strengthens the case for immediate investigative escalation. The tactical implementation was now officially beyond my direct control, transferred to federal authorities with jurisdiction and resources to advance the case through formal channels. But this transition had been anticipated and incorporated into my strategy from the beginning. The objective of these first tactical moves had never been personal control of the investigation, but rather strategic positioning that would ensure optimal outcomes once federal authorities became involved. As Marcus and I left the federal building, he confirmed that the meeting had achieved its objectives. They're fully engaged now. The combination of comprehensive historical documentation and actionable intelligence about imminent transactions creates the perfect conditions for aggressive investigation. Based on what we presented today, they'll likely seek formal authorization for surveillance and financial monitoring within days, not weeks. The drive home provided opportunity for reflection on this first phase of active measures. The transition from preparation to action had been executed according to plan, with each step building logically upon previous groundwork. The methodical approach had established my credibility, secured appropriate legal protections, and positioned the investigation for maximum effectiveness. Meanwhile, Michael remained completely unaware that his financial world had begun to unravel. The day of my meeting with federal investigators, he had called to inform me he would be working late on the Wellington account, the fictional client that frequently served as cover for his extramarital activities. I had responded with the expected supportive understanding, maintaining the performance that had become second nature. This jarring contrast between the significant investigative machinery now mobilizing against him and his continued confidence in his deceptions created a strange cognitive dissonance. The man who believed himself too clever to be caught, too sophisticated to be exposed, had already been thoroughly documented as a criminal by the wife he had systematically underestimated. Decor. First tactical moves had been completed with precision and discipline. The foundation was established, the authorities engaged, the investigation advancing. The momentum had shifted irrevocably, though Michael wouldn't recognize that fact for weeks to come. By the time he realized what was happening, the evidence would be secured, the financial trails documented, and his options severely limited. The woman he had dismissed as financially naive had just initiated what would likely become one of the most thoroughly documented tax fraud prosecutions in recent regional history. The tactical chess pieces were in motion, advancing according to a strategy he couldn't see and wouldn't comprehend until it was far too late to counter effectively. With the IRS investigation now formally underway, I turned my attention to developing a more comprehensive support network, a carefully constructed system of professional relationships that would provide both tactical advantages and strategic resilience as events progressed. This network building required a fundamentally different approach than the evidence collection and agency engagement that had occupied my initial efforts. Where those activities demanded secrecy and isolation, effective network development required selective visibility and strategic connection with individuals whose expertise, authority, or positioning could advance my objectives. My first priority was expanding my legal support structure beyond Marcus Whitman's primary expertise in tax law and criminal defense. While his guidance had been invaluable during the initial IRS engagement, the evolving situation required specialists in additional areas, particularly divorce proceedings, asset recovery, and potential civil litigation. Through Marcus's professional connections, I arranged confidential consultations with Jennifer Hayes, a divorce attorney known for handling high-net-worth separations involving complex financial situations. Our initial meeting took place at her firm's satellite office in a neighboring county, another location deliberately selected to minimize the risk of accidental exposure. "This is an unusual situation," Jennifer acknowledged after reviewing the preliminary information I had provided. "Most cases involving financial misconduct are discovered during divorce proceedings. You're approaching this in reverse order. The financial crimes investigation is preceding and will likely inform the divorce strategy." "That's intentional," I explained. "Standard divorce proceedings would have given Michael advance warning and opportunity to hide assets. The federal investigation freezes significant financial movement, while documenting criminal activity that will be highly relevant to equitable distribution." Jennifer nodded thoughtfully. "It's strategically sound. The evidence gathered through federal investigation will be substantially more comprehensive than what we could obtain through normal discovery processes. And courts tend to view documented financial crimes very unfavorably when determining asset division." She outlined a coordinated approach that would align divorce timing with the progress of the criminal investigation, filing at a strategic moment when federal actions had secured assets, but before formal charges might complicate financial settlements. This synchronization would require careful monitoring of both processes and precise timing decisions. "We'll need to maintain regular, secure communication with Marcus to ensure the divorce strategy complements rather than compromises the criminal proceedings," she noted. The coordination between these parallel legal tracks will be critical to achieving optimal outcomes in both. With divorce representation arranged, I next focused on financial recovery expertise. Clara had recommended Brandon Michaels, a forensic asset recovery specialist, whose firm worked primarily with victims of financial crimes to locate and reclaim misappropriated funds. Our meeting took place at a quiet cafe selected for its absence of surveillance cameras and minimal staff. Based on the documentation you've shown me, we're looking at multi-layered concealment strategies, Brandon observed after reviewing selected financial records. The offshore structures, particularly the Liechtenstein and Singapore connections, suggest sophisticated attempts to distance assets from their origins. Can they be traced and recovered? I asked, focusing on the practical implications. Almost. Certainly, he confirmed. The very mechanisms designed to hide money create distinctive patterns when you know what to look for. Modern financial forensics can follow these trails with remarkable precision, especially when we have access to the originating accounts and initial transfer documentation, which your evidence provides. Brandon outlined a comprehensive asset tracing strategy that would run parallel to both the federal investigation and divorce proceedings, identifying hidden funds, documenting ownership chains, and establishing recovery mechanisms that could be implemented once legal proceedings created the necessary authority for reclamation. The key is coordination, he emphasized, echoing Jennifer's earlier point. Federal action may freeze some assets but overlook others. Divorce proceedings create certain financial disclosure requirements but have jurisdictional limitations. My team can help identify and address the gaps between these processes to ensure comprehensive financial recovery. The third critical addition to my network came through Emma Richardson, my former colleague who had provided initial verification of my findings. She introduced me to Daniel Parker, a reputation management consultant who specialized in helping wronged parties navigate the public dimensions of high-profile legal proceedings. Financial crimes at this level rarely remain private, Daniel explained during our confidential consultation. When federal charges become public, there will be media interest, professional community attention, and social network reactions. Having a strategic approach to managing these dimensions can significantly impact both legal outcomes and personal well-being. He outlined a measured communication strategy that would position me appropriately as events unfolded, neither seeking publicity nor appearing to hide, providing factual responses when necessary without fueling speculation, maintaining professional dignity throughout what might become a highly publicized case. The goal isn't to win a public relations battle, he clarified. It's to ensure that external perceptions don't negatively impact legal proceedings or future professional opportunities. The narrative established during this period will have long-term implications for your post-divorce life and career. This forward-looking perspective, considering not just the immediate legal challenges, but the subsequent rebuilding of my professional and personal identity, added an important dimension to my strategic planning. Each member of this expanding network contributed unique expertise while reinforcing a consistent approach, methodical, coordinated, focused on comprehensive rather than merely punitive outcomes. As these professional relationships developed, I maintained rigorous security protocols, using different meeting locations, secure communication channels, and careful documentation control. No single advisor had complete visibility into all aspects of my strategy, creating compartmentalized knowledge that reduced vulnerability while ensuring necessary coordination through my central management. The professional network was supplemented by a small but critical personal support system. Individuals who provided emotional rather than tactical support during a period of extraordinary stress and complex performance. This included Dr. Sarah Levine, a therapist specializing in betrayal trauma and complicated divorce situations, who helped me process the emotional dimensions of Michael's deception without compromising my strategic discipline. What you're experiencing combines multiple significant stressors, Dr. Levine observed during one of our sessions. The emotional betrayal of infidelity, the financial betrayal of fraud, the cognitive dissonance of maintaining a performance. While pursuing accountability, each would be challenging in isolation. Combined, they create extraordinary psychological pressure. Our weekly sessions provided a controlled environment for acknowledging and processing these emotions without allowing them to interfere with necessary actions. This emotional maintenance proved as important as any tactical preparation, ensuring my decision-making remained clear and strategic rather than reactive or impulsive. By the 6-week mark following my initial IRS submission, the network had developed into a comprehensive support structure. Legal, financial, reputational, and emotional resources aligned around a coordinated strategy. Each component operated with appropriate independence while maintaining necessary connections through secure channels I personally managed. This network development coincided with significant progress in the federal investigation. Agent Chen provided regular updates through our secure communication channel, confirming that surveillance had been established on Michael's financial activities and that preliminary findings supported the evidence I had provided. The real-time observation of the offshore transfers you identified has been particularly valuable, he noted in one update. We've been able to document the entire transaction chain, from initial domestic accounts through multiple international transfers. This type of active surveillance evidence is especially compelling in criminal proceedings. The investigation had expanded to include additional federal agencies. The FBI had become involved due to potential wire fraud implications, and the SEC had opened a parallel inquiry into the possible securities violations identified through Clara's analysis. This multi-agency engagement created both additional resources for investigation and more comprehensive potential charges. Throughout this period, I maintained the performance of normal marital life with remarkable discipline. My interactions with Michael remained consistent with established patterns, managing household responsibilities, participating in social obligations, responding to his increasingly infrequent communications with appropriate interest and support. The performance required constant vigilance, but provided critical operational security as the various investigations progressed. Any premature indication of my knowledge or involvement could have triggered defensive actions that might compromise evidence collection or asset preservation. Michael's confidence remained absolute, his perception of me unchanged despite the sophisticated network I had assembled and the federal machinery now monitoring his every financial move. He continued to dismiss my occasional financial questions with the same condescending explanations, unaware that each response was being documented and analyzed by multiple professional experts. The contrast between appearance and reality grew, increasingly stark, between the supposedly naive housewife Michael believed he had married and the strategic architect coordinating a multidimensional response to his criminal activities. Between the successful financial expert he presented to the world and the desperate fraudster scrambling to maintain increasingly vulnerable schemes. This period of network development and investigation expansion created a strange liminal space, a time between the initiation of accountability and its ultimate manifestation. The mechanisms were in motion, but had not yet become visible to their target. The consequences were inevitable, but had not yet materialized. The strategic patience required during this phase was perhaps the most challenging aspect of the entire process. Having set events in motion, I now needed to allow them proper time to develop, to resist the impulse for premature confrontation or emotional disclosure that might compromise the methodical approach I had constructed. The network I had assembled provided critical support during this waiting period. Regular secure briefings with various team members maintained momentum while reinforcing the importance of coordinated timing. Each professional brought updates from their respective areas of responsibility, creating a comprehensive picture of developments across multiple fronts. As this network continued to solidify and expand, the balance of power shifted inexorably, though invisibly to Michael. The isolated, underestimated wife had become the central node in a sophisticated professional network focused on documenting, exposing, and creating consequences for his criminal behavior. The first tactical moves had initiated the process. The network development had created the infrastructure to sustain and expand it. The next phase would bring these elements into increasing alignment as the various investigations progressed toward their inevitable convergence. Living with Michael while orchestrating his downfall created a peculiar psychological state, a bifurcated reality where I simultaneously inhabited two distinct worlds. One was visible, performed, a continuation of the marriage role I had played for years. The other was hidden, authentic, focused on the methodical pursuit of justice and accountability. This dual existence required extraordinary compartmentalization. Each morning, I would transform from strategic architect to supportive wife, shifting my language patterns, body language, and conversational focus to maintain the persona Michael expected. Each evening, I would reverse the transformation, setting aside the performance to engage with my network of professionals through secure channels. The cognitive demands of this sustained performance are substantial, Dr. Levine noted during one of our sessions. You're essentially operating as a deep cover agent in your own home, maintaining a convincing facade while pursuing completely different objectives than those you're presenting. The performance wasn't merely passive deception, it required active engagement with Michael's continuing betrayals. When he called to explain he'd be working late, while his location tracker showed him at a hotel, I expressed appropriate understanding. When he mentioned business expenses that I knew were personal indulgences with his mistress, I asked suitable questions about the fictional clients involved. Each of these interactions required delicate calibration, showing enough interest to seem engaged, but not so much as to trigger suspicion, maintaining emotional responses consistent with my established patterns while internally documenting each new deception. The psychological toll of this constant performance was considerable, creating a strange disconnection between external behavior and internal reality. The dual existence extended beyond interpersonal dynamics into practical logistics. I maintained two distinct sets of records, communication systems, and daily schedules. My visible calendar showed household management, social engagements, and volunteer activities. My hidden calendar tracked meeting times with federal investigators, legal consultations, and financial recovery planning sessions. This separation required rigorous attention to detail. Devices used for secure communications never entered our home. Documents related to the investigation remained in physically separated secure locations, and all scheduling was designed to ensure my visible activities provided plausible cover for my actual movements. Your operational security measures would impress most intelligence professionals, Marcus commented during one of our coordination meetings. The separation between your visible and covert activities is remarkably comprehensive. The comment wasn't merely flattering. It reflected a genuine achievement in maintaining separation between worlds that could not be allowed to intersect until precisely the right moment. Any premature connection between my public persona and my investigative activities would compromise not just tactical advantage, but potentially my personal safety. As the weeks progressed, Michael's financial schemes began showing subtle signs of stress. Invisible to casual observation, but increasingly apparent through the monitoring systems now in place. Federal surveillance had identified pattern changes in his offshore transfers, suggesting he was encountering unexpected resistance. In some channels, his working hours extended as he attempted to manage growing complications in his fraudulent structures. These developments created both opportunity and risk within my dual existence. The opportunity came from Michael's increasing distraction. His focus on addressing financial challenges reduced his attention to domestic matters, creating more operational freedom for my parallel activities. The risk emerged from his growing stress and potential volatility. As pressure mounted, his behavior became less predictable, requiring more careful management of our interactions. Watch for escalation indicators, Agent Chen advised during a secure update meeting. Financial stress often triggers behavioral changes that can manifest in personal relationships. If you observe significant mood alterations or unusual questioning about financial matters, we should accelerate certain protective measures. This guidance led to additional security protocols in my daily operations, creating emergency communication channels, establishing rapid response procedures, and developing contingency plans for immediate separation if Michael's behavior suggested increasing risk. These precautions remained background measures, prepared but not yet necessary as his attention remained focused on external rather than domestic concerns. The dual existence created unexpected moments of surreal contrast. During a dinner party with Michael's colleagues, I listened as he confidently discussed tax optimization strategies with another executive, offering advice on legitimate deductions while I silently calculated the federal sentencing guidelines that would likely apply to his own fraudulent tax activities. The cognitive dissonance in such moments was profound, requiring disciplined focus to maintain appropriate external responses while processing the layered ironies of the situation. These social performances became increasingly frequent as Michael, feeling financial pressure from changes he couldn't fully understand, sought to reinforce his professional image through expanded networking. Each event required careful preparation, reviewing relevant background information, anticipating likely conversations, planning responses that would maintain my established persona while avoiding any inadvertent disclosure of my actual knowledge. These social situations represent both risk and intelligence opportunities, Jennifer advised during a legal strategy session. While maintaining your cover story is paramount, these interactions often yield useful information about business relationships, financial concerns, or potential asset movements that wouldn't emerge in other contexts. Following this guidance, I developed a more structured approach to these events, identifying specific information objectives for each social engagement while maintaining rigorous barriers against disclosure. This transformed what had been merely stressful performance obligations into productive intelligence-gathering opportunities that often yielded valuable insights into Michael's deteriorating financial situation. The most challenging aspect of the dual existence wasn't the practical, logistics, or the performance requirements. It was the fundamental ethical navigation required. I was simultaneously upholding and violating traditional marriage expectations, pursuing justice through methods that required controlled deception, and balancing personal accountability with strategic patience. Dr. Levine provided essential guidance through this ethical complexity. What you're experiencing is a form of necessary compartmentalization, she explained. You're not maintaining this dual existence from malice or manipulation. You're creating a controlled environment for accountability that wouldn't be possible through more conventional approaches. This framing helped reconcile the apparent contradictions in my position. The performance wasn't betrayal, but containment, creating a stable situation where evidence could be properly documented and appropriate legal processes engaged. The deception wasn't vindictive, but protective, preventing premature disruption that would compromise legitimate accountability. As the federal investigation progressed from initial inquiry to active case development, my dual existence began shifting toward eventual resolution. Agent Chen confirmed that they had established surveillance on all major financial channels, documented multiple instances of active fraud, and identified the full network of shell companies and offshore accounts Michael had established. We're approaching the point where formal action becomes both possible and strategically appropriate, he noted during a secure update. The evidence threshold for search warrants and potential arrest has been met. We're now in the planning phase for coordinated enforcement actions. This development triggered implementation of the synchronization protocols my network had established, aligning potential federal actions with divorce filing preparations, asset recovery positioning, and personal security measures. Each component had been designed to activate in a specific sequence, creating coordinated progression rather than haphazard parallel processes. Jennifer accelerated preparation of divorce documents, positioning them for filing at precisely the right moment relative to federal enforcement actions. Brandon's asset recovery team completed preliminary tracing of offshore funds, establishing the documentation needed for potential emergency freeze orders. Daniel prepared measured public statements that could be issued if federal actions generated media attention. Throughout this acceleration, I maintained the external performance with unwavering discipline. My interactions with Michael remained consistent with established patterns, showing no indication of the impending convergence of investigative threads. This final period of dual existence was perhaps the most demanding, continuing the performance, while knowing its conclusion was now imminent rather than theoretical. The psychological strain during this terminal phase is typically most intense, Dr. Levine had warned during an earlier session. Maintaining operational discipline when resolution is in sight requires extraordinary focus. The temptation to reveal knowledge prematurely or accelerate processes for emotional closure can be almost overwhelming. Her prediction proved accurate. As federal action approached, maintaining the performance became increasingly challenging, not from fear of discovery but from the growing impulse to end the charade, to finally show Michael that his perception had been fundamentally flawed, to witness the moment of realization when he understood the consequences of his dismissal and deception. Resisting this impulse required returning to first principles, remembering that the objective wasn't emotional confrontation, but comprehensive accountability. The dual existence wasn't sustainable indefinitely, but its conclusion needed to come through coordinated legal processes rather than personal revelation. The final days of this period took on a dreamlike quality. Routine morning conversations about household matters while knowing federal agents were finalizing raid preparations, casual discussions about future social engagements while divorce papers awaited filing, normal domestic routines performed against the background of imminent, systemic disruption. Michael remained completely unaware, his confidence in my ignorance so complete that he never questioned the occasional scheduling anomalies or subtle changes in routine that accommodated my parallel activities. His perception of me remained fixed. The financially naive wife focused on domestic matters, incapable of understanding the sophisticated mechanisms of his financial world. This profound misperception, this fundamental failure to recognize the capabilities of the woman he had married, had created the perfect operational environment for developing the case against him. The dual existence that might have been impossible with a more observant partner had been sustained for months because Michael saw exactly what he expected to see. Nothing more, nothing less. As Agent Chen confirmed the final enforcement timeline, I prepared for the imminent collapse of this dual existence. The performance that had been necessary for strategic purposes would soon be replaced by authentic engagement with legal and financial realities. The hidden world of investigation and preparation would emerge into public view through formal legal proceedings. The woman Michael believed he had married, the limited, domestic-focused persona I had performed to maintain operational security, would disappear, replaced by the actual strategic architect who had methodically documented his crimes and coordinated the multi-agency response to them. The dual existence would resolve into a single, integrated reality where capabilities previously hidden would be fully revealed. This approaching integration, this imminent collapse of separated worlds into unified accountability, created not anxiety but a profound sense of alignment. The performance had been necessary but temporary, a strategic means to a justice-oriented end. Its conclusion would bring not just consequences for Michael's actions, but liberation from the cognitive and emotional demands of sustained compartmentalization. The dual existence had served its purpose, creating the stable environment necessary for comprehensive documentation and coordinated response. Its approaching conclusion represented not an ending, but a transition, from hidden accountability to public consequences, from strategic patience to manifest justice. If Michael's greatest strength was his confidence in his own intelligence, it was also his most profound vulnerability. Throughout our marriage, I had observed a recurring pattern in his approach to challenges, a fundamental belief that he was consistently the smartest person in any situation. This certainty created predictable blind spots that became increasingly relevant as the investigation progressed. The most significant weakness in Michael's carefully constructed fraud system wasn't technical, but psychological. He couldn't conceive of being outmaneuvered, particularly by those he had mentally classified as less sophisticated than himself. This created a critical failure of imagination, an inability to recognize emerging threats until they had already bypassed his defenses. The pattern is consistent across his financial activities, Clara noted during one of our strategic review sessions. He creates sophisticated structures but rarely implements contingency protocols. When challenges emerge, he responds with increasingly complex mechanisms rather than strategic reassessment. This observation aligned with patterns I had documented in his personal behavior. When questioned about discrepancies, Michael would elaborate rather than simplify, adding layers of explanation that obscured rather than clarified. When faced with opposing perspectives, he would dismiss rather than evaluate, categorizing contradictory information as misunderstanding rather than potential insight. Agent Chen's investigation had revealed similar vulnerabilities in Michael's financial crimes. His fraud methodology shows remarkable sophistication in structure, but surprising rigidity in adaptation, he explained during a secure briefing. When regulatory changes affected certain offshore channels, he responded by creating additional complexity rather than developing alternative approaches. This psychological profile provided strategic advantages as the investigation progressed. Michael's consistent underestimation of potential opposition meant he rarely conducted counter-surveillance or implemented serious operational security measures. His confidence in his superior understanding meant he documented his activities more thoroughly than a more cautious criminal might, creating substantial evidence trails that strengthened the case against him. Most critically, his dismissal of my financial capabilities created a perfect blind spot regarding the most significant threat to his operations. While he implemented sophisticated measures to prevent detection by regulatory authorities or financial institutions, he took no precautions against the person with the most intimate access to his daily activities and documentation. Brandon's forensic analysis identified additional systemic weaknesses in Michael's financial structures. His approach shows a common pattern among sophisticated financial criminals: over-reliance on complexity rather than genuine security, he explained. He created elaborate transaction sequences that obscure observation from outside but become predictable once you identify the underlying patterns. This predictability allowed Brandon's team to trace financial movements that Michael believed were untraceable, identifying accounts and assets that had been hidden behind multiple corporate entities and jurisdictional barriers. The very complexity that Michael trusted for protection had created distinctive patterns that, once recognized, made his financial movements surprisingly easy to track. Michael's professional behavior revealed additional vulnerabilities. His consulting practice was built on projecting absolute confidence, positioning himself as an unquestionable authority on operational efficiency and financial optimization. This approach had succeeded in building his client base, but had also created dependency on maintaining a flawless professional image. His business model requires perfect perception management, Jennifer noted during a strategy session focused on potential divorce proceedings. Unlike established firms that can weather reputation challenges, his practice depends entirely on personal credibility. When that's compromised, he has no institutional structure to sustain operations. This insight proved valuable in understanding how federal actions would affect not just Michael's personal finances, but his entire professional ecosystem. His vulnerability to reputation damage extended beyond embarrassment to existential threat. Without his carefully maintained image of success and expertise, his business model would collapse completely. The most exploitable weakness, however, emerged from the psychological foundation of Michael's fraud rather than its technical execution. Throughout our marriage, I had observed that his financial crimes weren't merely opportunistic. They reflected a profound sense of entitlement, a belief that conventional rules simply didn't apply to someone of his intelligence and capability. This type of psychological profile typically resists acknowledging accountability even when confronted with overwhelming evidence, Dr. Levine explained during one of our sessions. The cognitive dissonance between self-perception as exceptionally intelligent and the reality of being caught creates particular vulnerability to catastrophic emotional responses when the facade finally collapses. This psychological insight informed the coordinated approach to enforcement actions. The federal team developed a strategy that would maximize this vulnerability, creating circumstances where Michael's preferred defense mechanisms of elaboration, dismissal, and counter-narrative would be completely ineffective. As the investigation approached its conclusion, Agent Chen outlined the enforcement approach. Based on the evidence collected and your insights into the subject's psychology, we're planning a simultaneous execution of search warrants at both his office and residence, coordinated with freeze orders on all identified accounts. This approach prevents evidence destruction while creating maximum psychological impact. The timing was calculated for strategic advantage, planned for early morning on a day when Michael had important client meetings scheduled, creating additional pressure through professional disruption. The warrants would be executed by teams thoroughly briefed on both the financial evidence and Michael's likely psychological responses, prepared to manage resistance through established protocols rather than improvised reactions. Jennifer's divorce strategy aligned with this enforcement timeline, positioning legal filings to coincide with the initial federal actions. The simultaneous nature of criminal investigation and divorce proceedings creates optimal leverage regarding asset division and financial disclosure, she explained. The pressure from multiple legal fronts typically overwhelms attempt at concealment or resistance. As these plans developed, I maintained careful observation of Michael's behavior, looking for indications that he might have detected the approaching threat. His patterns remained consistent: continued confidence in his financial manipulations, ongoing dismissal of my financial understanding, uninterrupted focus on maintaining his professional image. The blind spots in his perception remained intact, shielding him from recognition of his impending downfall. The final weakness in Michael's position became evident as federal investigators completed their financial analysis. Despite his sophisticated fraud mechanisms, he had failed to establish genuine financial independence. His lifestyle, business operations, and future planning all depended on continuous access to the funds he had fraudulently obtained and concealed. Unlike some financial criminals who create legitimate parallel resources, your husband has structured his entire financial existence around continuous access to these hidden funds, Brandon explained during our final planning session. When these resources are frozen through enforcement actions, he will have virtually no independent financial capability. This complete dependency on fraudulent financial structures created extraordinary vulnerability to the coordinated actions now prepared against him. The simultaneous freezing of accounts, seizure of records, and initiation of criminal proceedings would create not just legal jeopardy, but immediate practical crisis, removing access to the resources he depended on for daily operations and personal expenditures. As the date for federal action approached, I reviewed the comprehensive analysis of Michael's vulnerabilities with the core team of professionals who had helped develop the response strategy. What emerged was a clear picture of a man whose greatest strengths had created his greatest weaknesses, whose confidence had become blindness, whose complexity had become predictability, whose dismissal of others had created his own exposure. The antagonist's weaknesses had been systematically identified, analyzed, and incorporated into a strategic response that would transform his perception of untouchable success into the reality of comprehensive accountability. The systems he believed provided perfect protection would prove fundamentally vulnerable to the very person he had most consistently underestimated. What had begun as methodical documentation transformed into cascading developments as multiple streams of investigation converged. The carefully established foundation now supported rapidly accelerating action across legal, financial, and investigative fronts. The catalyst came unexpectedly. A routine audit of one of Michael's business clients triggered closer examination of consulting expenses. The auditor, noticing irregularities in documentation, flagged several transactions for secondary review. This seemingly minor development created ripple effects through Michael's carefully constructed fraud ecosystem. Financial crimes often unravel from unexpected directions, Agent Chen explained during an urgent secure briefing. This audit has accelerated our timeline. The flagged transactions connect directly to accounts we're already monitoring, creating an investigative pathway we hadn't anticipated. The IRS Criminal Investigation Division moved to leverage this development, using the audit findings to secure additional monitoring authorities that expanded their visibility into Michael's business operations. What they discovered accelerated the case dramatically. Evidence that Michael had been falsifying client invoices, creating phantom services to justify payments that were then channeled through his tax evasion structures. This shifts the case from personal tax fraud to systematic business fraud involving multiple clients, Agent Chen noted. The scope has expanded significantly, with potential implications for several major corporations who unknowingly participated in these schemes. This expansion created momentum that quickly became self-sustaining. Each investigative thread yielded connections to additional fraudulent activities. Each documented transaction revealed links to previously unknown accounts. Each business relationship examined showed evidence of financial manipulation. Clara's team at Meridian Financial Forensics played a crucial role during this acceleration phase, providing specialized analysis that helped federal investigators navigate the increasingly complex financial landscape they were uncovering. The patterns are consistent but evolving, she reported after reviewing the latest findings. We're seeing adaptation in his methods over time, increasing sophistication, but also increasing risk as the schemes expanded. This evolution created a comprehensive timeline of criminal activity that strengthened the case substantially. The evidence didn't show isolated incidents that might be explained as errors or misunderstandings, but rather a systematic progression of deliberate fraud that had developed over years into an elaborate criminal enterprise. As the financial investigation accelerated, parallel developments emerged in tracking Michael's hidden assets. Brandon's asset recovery team identified a previously undiscovered property purchased through a layered ownership structure, a beachfront villa in a remote location that appeared designed as a potential escape option rather than an investment. This property acquisition shows a different pattern than his other assets, Brandon explained, presenting satellite imagery and ownership documentation. The extraordinary measures taken to obscure ownership suggest contingency planning rather than typical tax avoidance. The timing, purchased shortly after you discovered the affair, raises significant concerns about potential flight risk. This discovery triggered immediate reassessment of the enforcement timeline. What had been planned as a methodical process accelerated into urgent action coordination. Agent Chen initiated emergency protocols to secure monitoring of Michael's movements, while expediting the preparation of search and seizure warrants. The momentum wasn't limited to federal investigation. Jennifer accelerated divorce filing preparations, positioning the legal documents for immediate submission once federal actions commenced. The discovery of potential escape planning creates additional urgency for securing your financial interests. Through formal legal proceedings, she advised, we need to establish court jurisdiction over all assets before any potential flight attempt. Michael remained oblivious to these accelerating developments. His attention focused on managing the business client audit he believed was an isolated incident. His response followed his typical pattern, creating elaborate explanations for the flagged transactions, producing additional documentation that appeared to legitimize the expenses, projecting absolute confidence that the auditor's concerns were based on misunderstanding rather than actual irregularities. This approach had succeeded in previous instances of regulatory questioning, but now faced a fundamentally different situation. The auditor's findings weren't being evaluated in isolation but connected to the comprehensive investigation already in progress. Each explanation Michael provided was immediately cross-referenced against the extensive evidence already compiled, revealing contradictions and fabrications that further strengthened the case against him. The accelerating momentum created pressure on Michael that began manifesting in subtle behavioral changes: increased working hours, heightened irritability, more frequent late-night calls with financial contacts. These indicators suggested growing awareness that his financial structures were under stress, though he still showed no recognition of the true nature or extent of the threat. Agent Chen monitored these developments with increasing concern. The behavioral changes suggest he's implementing contingency measures, he noted during an emergency briefing. Combined with the discovery of the potential escape property, these indicators significantly elevate the risk profile of the case. The federal response accelerated accordingly. What had been planned as separate phases of investigation consolidated into a comprehensive enforcement action: simultaneous search warrants for home, office, and storage locations, coordinated freeze orders for all identified accounts, formal notifications to financial institutions regarding suspected fraud connected to his transactions. During this critical period, maintaining my dual existence became increasingly challenging, but more essential than ever. Any premature indication of my knowledge or involvement could trigger desperate measures from Michael, potentially compromising both the investigation and my personal safety. I maintained the established performance with rigorous discipline, responding to his increasing stress with appropriate concern, accepting his vague explanations about work complications, continuing normal household operations as though nothing extraordinary was developing. This performance created particular strain as I simultaneously participated in urgent planning for the enforcement actions that would dramatically alter our lives. Morning conversations with Michael about mundane domestic matters would be followed hours later by secure briefings about the federal raids being prepared against him. Evening meals where he discussed client challenges would be followed by late-night, secure communications with legal and financial advisors preparing for the aftermath of his arrest. The convergence point approached with inexorable momentum. Agent Chen confirmed the final enforcement timeline: warrants to be executed at 6 a.m. the following Tuesday, coordinated with freeze orders implemented simultaneously across multiple financial institutions. The timing was strategic, selected to ensure Michael would be home rather than already at his office, preventing any opportunity to destroy evidence when he became aware of the investigation. Once enforcement actions begin, the situation will evolve rapidly, Agent Chen advised during our final pre-enforcement briefing. The simultaneous nature of these actions is designed to create overwhelming pressure, preventing evidence destruction, asset movement, or potential flight, but also typically triggers significant psychological response when the subject realizes the comprehensive nature of the investigation. As this decisive moment approached, the acceleration created a strange temporal distortion. Months of methodical preparation suddenly compressed into hours of urgent finalization. Each component of my network moved with practiced precision to secure their respective elements of the response strategy. Jennifer finalized the divorce filing, positioning it for submission immediately after federal actions commenced. Brandon's team prepared emergency filings to secure any assets not covered by federal freeze orders. Daniel developed measured statements for potential media inquiries that might follow public enforcement actions. Dr. Levine provided final guidance on managing the psychological transition from covert to overt proceedings. The night before the scheduled enforcement, Michael returned home later than usual, his expression showing the strain of managing the escalating complications in his financial schemes. He offered the familiar explanation about client challenges, unaware that the regulatory complications he vaguely referenced were directly connected to the investigation he would face the following morning. I maintained the performance flawlessly, offering sympathy for his professional stress while showing no indication of my knowledge of its true cause. This final evening of our fraudulent marriage carried a strange poignancy. The last hours of a relationship built on systematic deception, the final performance of a role I had maintained for strategic necessity rather than authentic connection. Michael finally slept. I reviewed the comprehensive preparations for what would follow. The accelerating momentum had transformed methodical documentation into imminent accountability. Years of financial crimes and personal betrayal would face coordinated response through federal investigation, legal proceedings, and financial recovery actions. The careful foundation established over months would now support the swift and comprehensive consequences about to unfold. The acceleration had been managed with the same strategic discipline that characterized the entire response, leveraging emerging developments while maintaining coordinated action across multiple domains. What Michael would experience as sudden, overwhelming disruption was in fact the culmination of precisely orchestrated processes designed to ensure comprehensive accountability. The morning of the federal enforcement action dawned with remarkable ordinariness. Sunlight filtered through bedroom curtains, the coffee maker cycled through its programmed brewing sequence, and birds called from the maple tree outside our kitchen window. This mundane domestic scene stood in stark contrast to the extraordinary events about to unfold. I had been awake since 4:30 a.m., having slept little during the night. Not from anxiety, but from a heightened state of alertness, a focused readiness, for the pivotal moment that would transform theoretical planning into tangible reality. I moved through morning routines with practiced precision, preparing coffee and reviewing news headlines as I did every day, the perfect picture of normal domestic life. Michael emerged from the bedroom at 5:45 a.m., dressed in the expensive casual attire he favored before changing into business formal at his office. His expression showed lingering stress from the previous evening, but with the renewed confidence that came with morning, the belief that whatever challenges had seemed overwhelming in night's darkness would yield to his intelligence and strategic thinking in daylight. "Early start today?" I asked, pouring his coffee exactly as he preferred. "Light cream, no sugar." "Meeting with the Richardson team at 7:30, he replied, checking his watch. "Need to get ahead of those audit questions before they escalate further." The irony of his statement hung in the air, unrecognized by him but profound in its implications. The escalation he feared was already far beyond his capacity to manage. The questions he planned to address were mere symptoms of a comprehensive investigation he couldn't yet comprehend. I nodded with appropriate interest, maintaining the performance that had become second nature. "Will you be home for dinner? I was thinking of making that salmon you like." This mundane domestic planning, discussing evening meals while federal agents prepared to execute search warrants, created a surreal cognitive dissonance that characterized these final moments of our fraudulent marriage. The parallel realities were about to collide with force that would permanently alter both our lives. Michael checked his calendar with the casual confidence of someone whose schedule remains within his control. "Should be back by 7, unless the Richardson situation gets complicated." "I'll plan for 7:30 then," I replied, the perfect supportive wife adjusting to his professional needs. The conversation continued for several minutes. Ordinary morning exchanges about household matters, upcoming social obligations, minor domestic decisions. A choreographed normality performed on the edge of extraordinary disruption. At precisely 5:58 a.m., I excused myself to use the bathroom, a routine action that would position me away from the immediate area when federal agents arrived. This placement wasn't coincidental but strategic, creating appropriate distance from the initial enforcement actions while remaining within the secured environment. The doorbell rang at 6:01 a.m. Exactly on schedule according to the enforcement timeline, Agent, Chen had confirmed. From the bathroom, I heard Michael's footsteps in the hallway, the sound of the front door opening, then the clear, authoritative voice announcing federal agents with a search warrant. The moment of collision had arrived, the parallel realities, merging into a single, undeniable truth that would permanently transform both our lives. I remained in place, following the carefully established protocol for these initial moments of enforcement. My role was not to witness Michael's first confrontation with consequences, but to maintain appropriate distance until the situation was fully secured. I heard multiple voices now, professional, measured instructions from the agents, Michael's increasingly agitated responses as the reality of the situation began penetrating his comprehension. The sound of additional agents entering the house, the professional recitation of his rights, the systematic implementation of the search protocols that had been meticulously planned. After exactly 7 minutes, the time frame Agent Chen had indicated would be required for preliminary security, a female agent knocked on the bathroom door. "Mrs. Sullivan, I'm Special Agent Melissa Torres. The situation is secure now. We'd like to speak with you in the living room." I opened the door, presenting the appropriate mixture of confusion and concern that would be expected from someone unexpectedly encountering federal agents in their home. The performance wasn't entirely fabricated. Despite months of preparation, the concrete reality of armed federal agents in our home created genuine emotional response beyond theoretical planning. Agent Torres escorted me to the living room, where Michael sat on the sofa, his expression cycling rapidly between disbelief, anger, and calculation. 4 agents moved efficiently through the house, following the detailed search protocols developed through months of preparation. Agent Chen stood nearby, observing both the search progress and Michael's reactions with professional detachment. Michael looked up as I entered, his expression shifting immediately. "Rachel, these people are making a terrible mistake. Call Jeffrey immediately." Jeffrey Schmidt was his attorney for business matters, a corporate lawyer with no experience in criminal defense or federal prosecutions. Before I could respond, Agent Chen stepped forward, professional but direct. "Mr. Sullivan, we're executing federal search warrants related to an investigation into tax fraud, wire fraud, and potential securities violations. Simultaneous warrants are being executed at your office location, storage facilities, and other properties associated with your financial activities." The comprehensive nature of the enforcement action registered on Michael's face, the first indication that this wasn't a misunderstanding or isolated inquiry, but a coordinated federal case built on substantial evidence. His expression hardened as he attempted to reassert control through indignation. "This is outrageous. I'm a respected financial consultant. Whatever you think you're investigating is clearly a misunderstanding of legitimate business practices." The response was predictable, precisely the reaction his psychological profile had suggested would be his first defensive position. Agent Chen remained professionally neutral. "We have substantial evidence of systematic financial crimes extending over approximately 5 years. Your accounts at multiple financial institutions have been frozen pending further investigation, and we are seizing all electronic devices and financial records as specified in the warrants." Each statement landed with visible impact, not just the legal declarations, but the implicit revelation that months of investigation had preceded this moment. Michael's perception of himself as untouchable, as too intelligent to be caught, confronted the reality of a federal case built on comprehensive evidence and coordinated across multiple agencies. His attention turned to me again, his expression suggesting he expected me to be overwhelmed, confused by technical matters beyond my understanding. "Rachel, this is just a misunderstanding about tax strategies. It'll be cleared up quickly. Just stay calm and let me handle this." The dismissive reassurance, so consistent with his pattern of undermining my financial comprehension, created the perfect opening. The decisive opportunity I had anticipated had presented itself organically, allowing the transition from covert to overt positioning without artificial confrontation. "Actually, Michael," I said, my voice shifting from the supportive wife tone. He expected to something more measured, more professional. "I understand exactly what's happening." I turned to Agent Chen with a slight nod, the predetermined signal that I was ready to transition from the performance of uninformed spouse to acknowledged cooperating witness. He responded with a minimal gesture of confirmation. "Mr. Sullivan," Agent Chen said, his tone formal but not antagonistic, "I should inform you that Mrs. Sullivan has been cooperating with our investigation. The initial evidence that led to this case came through her disclosure of financial irregularities she discovered." The statement hung in the air between us, simple, direct, transformative in its implications. Michael stared at me, his expression cycling through disbelief, betrayal, and then a dawning comprehension that reconfigured his entire understanding of our relationship. "That's not possible," he said finally, his voice strained with effort to maintain control. "Rachel doesn't understand. Complex financial matters, she couldn't possibly—" "I have a master's degree in accounting with specialization in forensic analysis," I stated simply, without emotional inflection. "I worked for Deloitte before our marriage. I understand financial fraud quite thoroughly." The cognitive dissonance visibly overwhelmed him, the absolute certainty of my financial naivety colliding with the reality of my expertise. The foundation of his perception shattered, revealing the fundamental miscalculation that had enabled his downfall. "You've been—" he began, unable to complete the thought as its implications expanded in his awareness. "Documenting your crimes?" I finished for him. "Yes, for approximately 7 months, quite comprehensively." The decisive opportunity had arrived and been seized, not through emotional confrontation, but through simple factual revelation that demolished his fundamental assumptions. The moment represented not just personal disclosure, but strategic transition, from covert investigation to overt proceedings, from private documentation to public accountability. As Michael struggled to integrate this paradigm-shifting information, Agent Chen continued the professional implementation of the search protocols. The evidence collection proceeded with methodical efficiency, each item seized according to precisely defined parameters developed through months of preparation. The decisive moment had been perfectly executed, creating maximum impact through the collision of Michael's perception with documented reality. The opportunity had been identified, prepared for, and utilized with strategic precision, transforming theoretical planning into tangible consequences that would permanently alter both our lives. The living room of our home, once the showcase of our supposed domestic success, had transformed into the stage for a confrontation years in the making. Federal agents moved methodically through the space, documenting and securing evidence with professional precision. Michael sat rigidly on the sofa, his confident facade crumbling as the magnitude of the situation became increasingly apparent. The confrontation unfolding wasn't the emotional explosion typically portrayed in dramatic depictions of betrayal. There were no shouted accusations, no desperate pleas, no violent outbursts. Instead, it was something far more devastating, a systematic deconstruction of the narrative Michael had built about himself, his marriage, and his professional identity. Agent Chen approached with a tablet displaying financial records I had provided months earlier. "Mr. Sullivan, we have comprehensive documentation of funds diverted from your joint marital accounts to offshore entities in Liechtenstein and Singapore. These transfers were disguised as business expenses but used primarily for personal expenditures, including maintaining a separate residence and supporting your relationship with Catherine Jenkins." The clinical presentation of his infidelity, not as emotional betrayal but as documented financial fraud, created visible impact. The affair that he had carefully concealed was now reduced to evidence in a federal case. His intimate deceptions transformed into line items in a criminal investigation. These records are being presented simply to establish pattern and intent, Agent Chen continued, his tone remaining professionally neutral. The primary focus of our investigation is the systematic tax evasion conducted through your consulting business, involving approximately $4.7 million in unreported income over a 5-year period. The precise figure, drawn from the meticulous forensic accounting I had helped develop, landed with unmistakable force. This wasn't vague accusation, but specific, documented fraud that would be nearly impossible to dismiss as misunderstanding or accounting error. Michael's attorney arrived 40 minutes into the search, not Jeffrey Schmidt as Michael had requested, but Patricia Winters, a criminal defense specialist clearly summoned by Schmidt once he understood the nature of the federal action. Her arrival shifted the dynamic slightly, introducing professional legal representation into the confrontation. After a brief private consultation with Michael, Patricia addressed Agent Chen with measured formality. My client will not be making any statements at this time. We request clarification on the specific allegations and evidence supporting these extraordinary actions. The warrants contain detailed descriptions of the alleged violations, Agent Chen replied, providing copies of the documents. Your client is currently facing potential charges related to tax evasion, wire fraud, money laundering, and securities violations. The evidence includes banking records, communication documentation, client financial statements, and testimony from cooperating witnesses. As Patricia reviewed the warrants, her expression shifted subtly, professional concern deepening. As she recognized the comprehensive nature of the case, this wasn't a fishing expedition but a thoroughly developed federal prosecution supported by substantial evidence. Throughout this exchange, I maintained composed presence, neither confrontational nor apologetic, simply present as the reality I had documented became the official focus of federal action. My role in this confrontation wasn't to engage emotionally, but to represent the transition from private betrayal to public accountability. Michael finally addressed me directly, his voice strained with effort to maintain control. How could you do this after everything I've provided for us? The question revealed the fundamental misconception that had defined our relationship. His perception that material provision justified deception, that financial support entitled him to betrayal. The confrontation wasn't just about criminal charges, but about this fundamental imbalance in how he understood our marriage. You didn't provide for us, Michael, I replied, my tone even rather than accusatory. You used our marriage as cover for systematic fraud. You depleted our joint finances to support your affair. You built a life of deception that happened to include me as an unwitting participant. Patricia attempted to interrupt, concerned about potential self-incrimination, but Michael waved her off, fixated on understanding what seemed incomprehensible to him, how the woman he had systematically underestimated had orchestrated his downfall. But you couldn't have understood the financial structures, he insisted, his worldview still struggling to accommodate the reality before him. The offshore entities, the tax strategies, they're too complex. They're really not, I responded. Simply. The methods are sophisticated, but the principles are basic. Artificial losses, mischaracterized expenses, hidden income streams. Elementary fraud detection for someone with forensic accounting training. This direct challenge to his perception of superior financial acumen struck deeper than the legal jeopardy he faced. The confrontation wasn't just exposing his crimes, but dismantling his fundamental self-perception as the intellectual superior in our relationship. As the search neared completion, Agent Chen informed Michael that he wasn't being taken into custody at this time, a strategic decision that had been extensively discussed during case planning. The evidence collection and account freezes were designed to secure documentation and prevent asset flight while allowing the investigation to continue without immediate arrest. This approach created particularly effective psychological impact, leaving Michael in legal limbo, his accounts inaccessible, his business operations disrupted, his future uncertain. The confrontation wouldn't conclude with dramatic handcuffs, but with protracted uncertainty that would systematically dismantle the life he had constructed. As federal agents prepared to depart with the collected evidence, I retrieved a pre-packed suitcase from the guest room closet, preparation made weeks earlier for exactly this moment. The confrontation was transitioning from federal enforcement to personal separation, from criminal investigation to matrimonial dissolution. "I'll be staying elsewhere," I informed Michael. Not as emotional declaration, but as simple factual statement. "Your attorney will be receiving divorce filings this afternoon." The confrontation that had begun with federal warrants would continue through legal proceedings, financial investigations, and criminal prosecution. What Michael had dismissed as impossible had become his inescapable reality. The wife, he believed, incapable of understanding his financial activities, had not only comprehended them, but documented them with sufficient precision to support federal prosecution. The weeks following the federal raid unfolded with a precise inevitability that reflected the methodical preparation underlying every aspect of my response. The carefully constructed network operated with synchronized efficiency, each component advancing their respective elements of the comprehensive strategy. Michael's professional collapse was immediate and complete. News of the federal investigation spread rapidly through industry channels, triggering client departures, partnership dissolutions, and professional distancing that transformed his consulting practice from thriving enterprise to hollow shell. Within days, the frozen accounts created immediate practical crisis, leaving him unable to access the resources he had depended on for both business operations and personal expenses. Patricia Winters negotiated emergency living expense releases through the court, but these provided bare minimum support rather than the luxury lifestyle he had maintained through fraudulent means. The beachfront property I had discovered proved particularly significant in aftermath proceedings. Federal agents confirmed it had been prepared for potential escape, stocked with cash, equipped with communication devices not tied to his known accounts, furnished with materials suggesting planned extended absence. This discovery strengthened both the criminal case regarding flight risk and the divorce proceedings regarding asset concealment. My own transition proceeded according to carefully established plans. I moved into a secured apartment leased months earlier under my maiden name, maintaining privacy while the initial media interest in the case subsided. The financial preparations made during the documentation phase provided comfortable stability during this period, allowing focused attention on legal proceedings without immediate economic pressure. Jennifer's handling of the divorce filing proved strategically masterful. The submission coincided precisely with the federal enforcement actions, leveraging the comprehensive evidence of financial crimes to secure emergency asset protection orders that prevented any remaining resources from being concealed or depleted. Most revealing aftermath development came through Michael's evolving response as the full scope of the case against him became clear. His initial position, confident dismissal of misunderstandings that would be quickly resolved, gave way to increasingly desperate attempts at negotiation as the evidence mounted. He's finally recognizing the comprehensive nature of the documentation, Marcus observed during a legal update meeting. The progression is typical, from denial to bargaining to potential cooperation, as the reality of potential consequences becomes unavoidable. This progression culminated in a remarkable moment of recognition during a settlement conference 3 months after the initial enforcement action. Michael, now visibly transformed by the stress of criminal proceedings and financial collapse, addressed me directly for the first time since the confrontation in our home. "I never believed you could do this," he said, his tone more bewildered than angry. "I never thought you were capable of understanding what I was doing, let alone documenting it so thoroughly." The statement contained no apology, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, simply recognition of the fundamental miscalculation that had enabled his downfall. The woman he had systematically underestimated, whose intelligence and capabilities he had dismissed, had methodically constructed the case that destroyed everything he had built. This recognition, this final acknowledgement of his profound misjudgment, represented the closing of a circle that had begun with his casual dismissal of my financial understanding. The aftermath had transformed theoretical accountability into tangible consequences, abstract justice into concrete reality. 1 year after the federal enforcement action, I sat on the deck of my new coastal home, watching waves break against the shoreline as sunset painted the horizon in vivid orange and purple. The property, purchased with my portion of recovered assets and whistleblower compensation, represented not just financial security, but symbolic reclamation of independence. Michael had ultimately accepted a plea agreement, confessing to multiple federal charges in exchange for reduced sentencing. The negotiated settlement included full financial disclosure, cooperation with ongoing investigations related to client funds, and substantial restitution payments. The man who had once dismissed my financial capabilities was now serving a 57-month sentence in a federal correctional facility. The transformative impact extended far beyond personal vindication or financial recovery. The case had created ripple effects through regulatory systems, professional communities, and support networks for others experiencing similar situations. Brandon's asset recovery team had leveraged techniques developed during my case to create a specialized practice focused on identifying and reclaiming funds hidden through sophisticated offshore mechanisms. Clara's firm had established a dedicated division providing forensic support for individuals suspecting financial crimes within marriage or business partnerships. Most significantly, Jennifer had used insights from our case to develop educational resources helping individuals recognize and document financial abuse, creating practical guides that transformed complex forensic techniques into accessible approaches for those without specialized training. These extensions transformed what might have remained personal justice into systemic impact, using the specific mechanisms of Michael's accountability to create broader protections for others facing similar circumstances. The network developed for individual response had evolved into infrastructure supporting wider change. My own professional identity underwent parallel transformation. The expertise applied to documenting Michael's crimes became the foundation for a consulting practice, specializing in forensic analysis of financial fraud, particularly cases involving spousal deception or business partner malfeasance. The capabilities he had dismissed became the core of a successful career, helping others navigate similar situations. This professional evolution represented perhaps the most profound transformative impact, the complete reversal of Michael's dismissal. The financial understanding he had characterized as limited became recognized expertise. The skills he had belittled became valued professional capabilities. The woman he had underestimated became a respected authority in precisely the field he had claimed beyond her comprehension. The transformation wasn't about revenge, but reclamation, recovering not just financial resources, but professional identity, personal agency, and fundamental recognition of capability. What began as response to betrayal had become catalyst for comprehensive reconstruction of life, career, and purpose. As the sun slipped below the horizon, I reflected on the journey, from dismissed wife to forensic specialist, from financial victim to recognized expert. The transformation that had begun with systematic documentation of betrayal had culminated in systemic change benefiting others facing similar circumstances. The decisive lesson wasn't that betrayal demanded revenge, but that accountability created transformation. That methodical response to injustice could generate not just personal vindication, but positive evolution extending far beyond individual circumstances. The woman Michael believed incapable of understanding complex financial matters had not only comprehended them, but transformed them into mechanisms for broader justice and systematic change. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.